The history of the Hebrews begins in the fertile landscapes of Mesopotamia, in the same cultural cradle where the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians and Assyrians had already established great traditions of kingship, writing and monumental religion. It is here, along the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, that the earliest ancestors of the Hebrew people are situated by tradition, not as rulers of empires or builders of ziggurats, but as a nomadic family group whose identity was rooted in kinship and covenant rather than the monumental achievements of empire. The Hebrew story, as preserved in biblical texts and contextualized by archaeological evidence, begins with Abram, later known as Abraham, whose ancestral home is remembered as Ur of the Chaldees. This city, identified with the famous site of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, stood as one of the oldest urban centres of the Sumerian and later Babylonian world. Archaeological excavations by Leonard Woolley in the early 20th century revealed the extraordinary wealth of the royal tombs at Ur, a reminder of the sophistication of the environment from which the patriarchal traditions emerged. Ur, flourishing around 2000 BCE, was a centre of lunar worship, with its ziggurat rising in dedication to the moon god Nana. The Hebrew tradition situates Abram's departure from this environment as a profound rejection of polytheistic cults and urban centralization in favour of a wandering life guided by divine promise. The biblical narrative relates that Abram's father, Terah, set out with his household from Ur toward the land of Canaan, but stopped instead in Haran, a city to the north, situated in the upper reaches of the Euphrates. Haran, like Ur, was a major centre of moon god worship, showing that the cultural background of Abram's family was deeply enmeshed in Mesopotamian religious currents. Yet it is precisely within this cultural setting that the Hebrew tradition introduces its first decisive transformation, the call of Abram by a singular deity, commanding him to leave his father's house and his homeland for a land that would be shown to him. This movement from Mesopotamia to Canaan is not simply geographical, but represents a shift in worldview, where Mesopotamian societies bound their legitimacy to city gods and temple economies. Abram's identity was tied to a covenantal relationship with a deity who transcended territorial boundaries. Scholars have long debated the historicity of Abram and the patriarchs, situating them within the broader context of semi-nomadic movements in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Evidence from the Mari tablets, discovered in Syria, shows records of Amorite tribes wandering between Mesopotamia and the Levant, engaged in pastoralism, trade, and at times political negotiation. These Amorites, often described as West Semitic peoples, provide a cultural and linguistic backdrop for the Hebrews, who likewise spoke a Semitic tongue and practiced a semi-nomadic lifestyle that linked them to both Mesopotamian and Levantine spheres. The migration narrative preserves memories of this broader pattern. Abram's departure from Haran toward Canaan parallels historical movements of Amorite clans who left the Euphrates basin to settle in the land of Canaan, where they became part of the complex mixture of city-states, highland villages, and tribal groups that define the region. Archaeological surveys in the central hill country of Canaan reveal new settlement patterns beginning around 1200 BCE, often associated with the rise of Israelite identity, but even earlier periods show evidence of semi-nomadic groups moving between Mesopotamia and Canaan. The Hebrew narrative compresses these long processes into the story of one family guided by divine command. The land of Canaan itself was a diverse and contested space, positioned between the great powers of Egypt to the south and Mesopotamian states to the north and east. Canaan was never an empire but rather a patchwork of city-states such as Hazor, Megiddo and Jerusalem, each with its local ruler, fortified centre and surrounding agricultural lands. These city-states were frequently under the shadow of the larger empires, as seen in the Amarna letters, which document correspondence between Canaanite rulers and the Pharaoh of Egypt in the 14th century BCE. These texts reveal a world of shifting alliances, tribute, and military intervention. where small kings depended on Egyptian oversight and protection against rivals. Into this world the Hebrews would later enter, initially as outsiders, pastoralists without fixed cities or established dynasties, carrying with them a distinctive tradition that emphasized family lineage and covenant promises. The transition from Mesopotamia to Canaan also involves the process of identity formation. Where Mesopotamian religious systems emphasize pantheons with divine assemblies governing cosmic order, the Hebrew tradition began to focus increasingly on the singular authority of the God who called Abram. The covenant promise to give Abram descendants as numerous as the stars and to provide them with the land of Canaan becomes the central axis of the narrative. This divine promise, passed down through Isaac and Jacob, provides continuity through successive generations despite the uncertainties of wandering and settlement. The figure of Abram is placed in dialogue with the cultures he encounters. In Canaan he builds altars, establishing visible markers of devotion in a land dominated by local shrines to Baal and Asherah. His interactions with Egyptian pharaohs and Canaanite kings show that the Hebrews were not isolated but were part of the broader cultural currents of the Near East. The biblical account of Abram's encounter with Melchizedek, the king of Salem and priest of El Elyon, illustrates this interplay. Here, a Canaanite ruler is portrayed as priest of a deity called God Most High, suggesting shared recognition of a supreme power above localized deities. Such passages reveal the porous boundaries between Hebrew and Canaanite religious thought, while at the same time emphasizing the unique covenant relationship that distinguished the Hebrews. The migration from Mesopotamia to Canaan also reflects historical realities of subsistence and survival. Pastoral nomadism required movement in search of pasture and water, and the routes from the Euphrates basin into Canaan followed long-established trade and migration corridors. The Fertile Crescent itself was not a continuous lush region but depended on rivers, rainfall and seasonal cycles, all of which could shift with climate fluctuations. Drought, famine, and political instability frequently drove populations to relocate, and the Hebrew story of famine leading Abram into Egypt mirrors these broader realities. Archaeological evidence confirms that famines in the Levant during the Middle Bronze Age caused population displacements, with groups moving toward Egypt's Nile Delta in search of sustenance. In Egypt, the Hebrews encountered yet another great civilization, whose monumental architecture, centralized administration, and pantheon of gods contrasted sharply with their own fragile existence as a wandering clan. The tradition of Abram's sojourn in Egypt, though brief, foreshadows the much larger migration of his descendants centuries later. It also highlights the interconnectedness of the Near Eastern world, where Canaan functioned as a bridge between the Nile and Mesopotamia. Trade routes carried copper from Sinai, timber from Lebanon, and grain from Egypt, while armies and migrants moved along the same paths. The Hebrews, in leaving Mesopotamia for Canaan, placed themselves at the crossroads of civilizations, exposed to influences from every direction. The genealogical traditions that trace the Hebrews back to Shem, son of Noah, situate them within the broader framework of Semitic peoples, distinguished by language and cultural patterns but diverse in political organization. The very name Hebrew, or Ivri, is often understood to derive from a root meaning to cross over, reflecting both their migration across rivers and their liminal position between established civilizations. This sense of crossing, of existing at the margins of great empires while forging an independent identity, characterizes much of Hebrew history. Their earliest identity was not bound to kingship or empire, but to family narratives, promises, and memories of journeys. The transition from Mesopotamia to Canaan marks the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold through centuries of migration, settlement, exile, and return. It situates the Hebrews at the meeting point of cultures, shaped by and yet distinct from their neighbours, bound by traditions that emphasized covenant and faithfulness to a single God. From Ur to Haran, from Haran to Canaan, from Canaan to Egypt and back again, the narrative reflects the realities of a people whose survival depended on adaptability, resilience, and a sense of divine purpose that transcended the boundaries of kingdoms and empires. This early phase also provides the framework for understanding the generations that follow. Isaac inherits the promise and becomes the link between Abram's migration and Jacob's expansion into 12 tribes. Jacob, renamed Israel, will embody the transformation of a single family into a nation. The migrations that begin in Mesopotamia will extend into Egypt, setting the stage for oppression, deliverance, and eventual nationhood. But all of this flows from the initial call, the decisive movement from the heart of Mesopotamia into the land of Canaan, where the Hebrews first began to mark their presence in a world dominated by ancient powers. The story of Abraham, once called Abram, shifts from mere migration and survival into the deeper realm of covenant, a concept that becomes the foundation of Hebrew identity. In Mesopotamian tradition, kings established legitimacy through treaties with gods and political agreements with rival rulers, often sealed by oaths, sacrifices, or inscribed tablets. What makes the Hebrew account distinct is that the covenant binding Abraham to his God is framed not as a political contract, but as a personal relationship between deity and chosen patriarch, one that promises land, descendants, and blessing in exchange for loyalty, obedience, and trust. This covenant is not negotiated on equal terms, as in treaties between kings, but granted by divine initiative, setting a model that will be revisited throughout Hebrew history as successive generations reaffirm their obligations to a God who claims sovereignty not only over one tribe but over all creation. The covenant with Abraham unfolds in stages. Initially, Abram is called to leave his homeland with the promise of becoming a great nation. Later, after his arrival in Canaan and various trials, the covenant is renewed with specific rituals and signs. One account describes the dramatic cutting of animals in half, laid opposite one another, while a smoking firepot and flaming torch pass between the pieces. This imagery corresponds to ancient Near Eastern covenantal ceremonies, where parties would walk between severed animals to symbolize the fate awaiting those who broke the oath. In the Hebrew version, however, it is only the divine presence that passes between the pieces, signifying that the burden of fulfilling the covenant rests primarily on God's faithfulness. Another moment of covenantal confirmation comes with the promise of descendants, despite Abraham's advanced age and Sarah's barrenness. The narrative stresses the miraculous nature of the promise, distinguishing it from ordinary dynastic succession and rooting it in divine power rather than human fertility. The covenant also introduces the sign of circumcision, a physical marker on the body of every male descendant, establishing the Hebrew people as set apart. Circumcision was not unique to the Hebrews, as evidence shows Egyptian and other Semitic groups practiced it, but within Hebrew tradition it took on a special covenantal meaning, serving as an enduring reminder of belonging to the divine promise. The act of circumcision was not tied to adulthood or initiation into manhood, as in other cultures, but was performed on infants at 8 days old, signalling that covenant identity was conferred at birth, prior to any personal achievement. This integration of biological lineage and divine promise created a powerful sense of continuity that linked each generation directly to the covenant with Abraham. The patriarchal age, extending from Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, preserves traditions that are not easily verifiable through archaeology, but that reflect deep cultural memory. These stories describe semi-nomadic households with flocks, herds, servants, and extended kin groups moving through Canaan, interacting with city rulers and negotiating survival in a land dominated by fortified centres and agricultural communities. The patriarchs are portrayed not as kings or city builders, but as wealthy clan leaders whose influence derived from livestock, water rights, and family alliances. This lifestyle corresponds to what scholars describe as pastoral nomadism or semi-nomadism, documented throughout the ancient Near East. Records from Mary and other Bronze Age archives mention tribal groups that lived alongside city dwellers, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, sometimes being incorporated into political structures. The Hebrews fit into this wider context of tribal groups navigating a world dominated by larger powers. Abraham's covenant is tested through episodes that highlight trust in divine promises against apparent impossibility. The most famous is the command to sacrifice Isaac, the long-awaited son. The story emphasizes absolute devotion, with Abraham prepared to relinquish even the fulfillment of the covenant itself in obedience to the divine command. At the last moment, a ram is provided as a substitute, reinforcing the principle of obedience rewarded by divine provision. This event also introduces themes of substitutionary sacrifice that would resonate throughout later Hebrew ritual, particularly in the sacrificial system of the tabernacle and temple. The covenant is thus not merely an abstract promise, but a lived reality that demands faith, obedience, and often suffering. Abraham's interactions with neighbouring peoples further situate the patriarchal age within the political and cultural landscape of Canaan. His dealings with Pharaoh in Egypt, with Abimelech of Gerar, and with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah reveal the patriarch as a participant in the international dynamics of his time. The story of rescuing Lot from a coalition of Mesopotamian kings illustrates awareness of broader geopolitical events, where distant powers extended influence into Canaan. Archaeological evidence confirms that during the early 2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian rulers launched military campaigns into the Levant, seeking control over trade routes and resources. These episodes, while preserved in legendary form, align with the historical reality that Canaan was a contested land between great powers. The patriarchal narratives also preserve memories of religious diversity. Altars erected by Abraham at Shechem, Bethel and Hebron demonstrate that worship was conducted at local high places long before the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. These altars mark geographical points where the divine promise is reiterated, embedding sacred memory into the land itself. At the same time, the patriarchs often clash with or accommodate local religious practices, reflecting the complex interaction between Hebrew devotion and Canaanite cults. The figure of Melchizedek, priest-king of Salem, shows that worship of a Most High God was not exclusive to Abraham's line, hinting at broader currents of monotheistic or henotheistic belief in the region. The patriarchal age emphasizes family dynamics, inheritance and rivalry, themes that reflect both social realities and theological lessons. The struggle between Sarah and Hagar, and between their sons Isaac and Ishmael, illustrates tensions over legitimacy and divine favour. Ishmael, though blessed with his own lineage, is not the chosen heir of the covenant which passes through Isaac. This emphasis on divine election, rather than mere birth order, recurs throughout Hebrew tradition, as seen later in the preference of Jacob over Esau, Joseph over his brothers, and David over his elder siblings. The theme highlights the belief that covenantal destiny is determined by divine will rather than human custom. Isaac's role, though less dramatic, continues the covenantal line. His marriage to Rebekah, arranged through kinship ties back in Mesopotamia, underscores the importance of preserving identity through family alliances. Isaac's life reflects stability more than innovation, with fewer episodes of wandering and conflict, yet the covenant is reaffirmed to him, showing that divine promises endure across generations. His sons, Jacob and Esau, embody the ongoing struggle between brothers, with Jacob ultimately receiving the blessing and birthright, despite being the younger. This inversion of expectations reinforces the theme of divine choice. Jacob, later named Israel, represents the culmination of the patriarchal age. His story is filled with journeys, dreams, conflicts, and transformations. His vision of a ladder reaching to heaven at Bethel symbolizes the connection between the divine and human realms, reaffirming the covenant promises in vivid imagery. His marriages to Leah and Rachel, his complex household with 12 sons, and his eventual reconciliation with Esau reflect the messy realities of tribal life. Yet through these family struggles emerges the foundation of the 12 tribes of Israel, establishing the framework for later national identity. The covenant with Abraham thus finds its continuation in Jacob, whose name becomes synonymous with the entire people. The patriarchal narratives are not just family stories, but theological reflections on identity, destiny, and relationship with the divine. They emphasize hospitality, as seen in Abraham's reception of 3 visitors at Mamre. Interpreted in later tradition as a theophany, they stress justice and intercession, as in Abraham's dialogue with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. They highlight the role of women, whose actions often determine the course of events, whether Sarah's demand to expel Hagar, Rebekah's guidance in securing Jacob's blessing, or Rachel's struggle for children. These stories intertwine human weakness and divine faithfulness, creating a narrative that explains not only where the Hebrews came from, but why they were chosen and sustained despite their flaws. The patriarchal age also connects the Hebrews to the land of Canaan in ways that transcend temporary residence. Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah as a burial site establishes a permanent claim to the land, grounded not in conquest, but in ownership. This site, located at Hebron, becomes the ancestral tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, linking the covenant promise of land to tangible possession, however modest. The act of purchasing land rather than seizing it reflects a recognition that full possession awaits future fulfillment, but the seed of ownership is planted. The patriarchs' interactions with Egypt foreshadow later events. The temporary migrations during famine, the favour and suspicion of pharaohs, and the dependence on Nile resources anticipate the later descent of Jacob's household into Egypt during Joseph's time. These episodes highlight the vulnerability of pastoral groups to environmental fluctuations and the reliance on large estates for survival. They also establish the pattern of exile and return, dependence and deliverance that will recur throughout Hebrew history. The covenant with Abraham extends beyond his immediate descendants, as the promise includes that all nations of the earth shall be blessed through him. This universal dimension distinguishes the Hebrew covenant from purely ethnic or tribal arrangements, situating it within a broader divine plan that encompasses humanity as a whole. At the same time, the covenant is particular, tied to specific descendants and a specific land. This tension between universal and particular becomes a defining feature of Hebrew identity, influencing their interactions with surrounding nations and their understanding of their role in history. The patriarchal age concludes not with the full realization of promises, but with the anticipation of future fulfillment. Abraham dies with only a small portion of land. Isaac continues the line with limited influence, and Jacob's household eventually descends into Egypt. Yet the covenant remains the central thread, binding each generation to a destiny that transcends immediate circumstances. The narratives preserve memory, identity, and faith in a promise that extends far beyond the lifespan of any individual patriarch. The continuity from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob demonstrates that the covenant is not static but dynamic, reaffirmed and adapted in each generation. It encompasses tests of faith, family struggles, migration, and settlement. It shapes identity through rituals such as circumcision and through sacred geography, marked by altars and burial sites. It creates a people defined not by empire or conquest, but by promise and faithfulness. And it prepares the way for the next great phase of the Hebrew story, when Jacob's sons, particularly Joseph, will carry the family into Egypt, where new trials and transformations will shape the destiny of the Hebrews in ways that extend beyond the patriarchal age. The story continues through the figure of Isaac, whose life occupies a quieter space in the tradition, often overshadowed by the towering presence of Abraham before him and Jacob after him. Yet Isaac serves as the vital link, the living bridge that transmits the covenantal promises from the patriarch who first received them to the patriarch, whose descendants will embody them in national form. Isaac's role is not one of dramatic journeys or constant testing, but one of stability, continuity, and preservation. His life illustrates how the covenant survives not only through heroic acts, but also through the steady maintenance of faith across generations. He is remembered as the child of promise, born when Sarah's barrenness had long seemed insurmountable, his very existence marking the fulfillment of divine faithfulness to Abraham. Isaac's own narrative includes episodes that mirror his father's experiences. Like Abraham, he faces famine and goes to dwell in the territory of the Philistines. Like Abraham, he deceives local rulers about his wife, presenting Rebekah as his sister in an attempt to preserve his own life. These repetitions highlight both continuity and variation, showing how the same challenges confront each generation and how divine promises endure despite human fear and weakness. Isaac's wealth in flocks and wells brings him into conflict with local herdsmen, and the struggle over wells becomes symbolic of the tension between the Hebrews and surrounding peoples. Yet Isaac is also portrayed as a man of peace, seeking reconciliation and treaties rather than constant conflict. His life reflects the quieter side of covenantal existence, where prosperity, dispute, and resolution occur within the framework of divine blessing. The central drama of Isaac's household emerges in the lives of his sons, Jacob and Esau. Their rivalry begins even before birth, as the tradition recalls that the twins struggled within Rebekah's womb, prompting a divine oracle that the elder shall serve the younger. This foreshadowing of reversal introduces a recurring theme. The covenant line does not follow conventional inheritance rules, but instead operates according to divine choice. Esau, the firstborn, emerges from the womb red and hairy, becoming a skilled hunter and man of the open country. Jacob, grasping at his brother's heel, grows into a quieter man dwelling among the tents. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between the two brothers, not only in temperament but also in values. Esau, driven by immediate needs, famously sells his birthright for a meal of stew, while Jacob, though cunning and often manipulative, seeks the blessing and inheritance of the covenant. The blessing episode, where Jacob disguises himself to receive his father's blessing intended for Esau, illustrates the complexity of covenantal transmission. Isaac, blind in his old age, is deceived into bestowing the blessing on Jacob, setting in motion consequences that reverberate through generations. Esau's cry of anguish and his vow of revenge force Jacob into exile, fleeing to the land of Haran where his maternal relatives dwell. This exile echoes earlier migrations and begins the cycle of journeys that will mark Jacob's life. While Jacob's actions are ethically ambiguous, the tradition emphasizes that the divine purpose is fulfilled through them, reinforcing the theme that covenantal destiny operates beyond human schemes, even when accomplished through human weakness. Jacob's journey to Haran introduces one of the most iconic visions of the patriarchal age. At Bethel, he dreams of a stairway or ladder set upon the earth, with its top reaching heaven, and angels ascending and descending upon it. The vision reaffirms the covenant promises of land, descendants, and blessing, situating Jacob within the same divine framework as Abraham and Isaac. The imagery of the ladder symbolizes the ongoing connection between heaven and earth, a link that anchors Jacob's destiny to the divine will. He names the place Bethel, House of God, marking it as a sacred site that will remain significant in Hebrew tradition. In Haran, Jacob's life becomes entangled in the complex dynamics of family, marriage, and labour. He encounters his uncle Laban, a shrewd figure who mirrors Jacob's own cunning. Jacob falls in love with Rachel, but through Laban's deception he first marries her sister Leah. This reversal of expectations, where the deceiver is deceived, highlights the recurring theme of trickery and reversal in Jacob's life. Over the course of years, Jacob marries both sisters and their maidservants, resulting in a large household with 12 sons and a daughter. The births of these sons, often accompanied by rivalry between Leah and Rachel, form the foundation of the 12 tribes of Israel. Each son receives a name tied to the circumstances of his birth, reflecting the ongoing struggles of love, jealousy, and divine favour within the family. The 12 sons of Jacob represent more than individual children. They become tribal ancestors, each associated with a future clan that will form part of the Hebrew nation. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah are born to Leah. Dan and Naphtali to Bilhah, Rachel's maid. Gad and Asher to Zilpah, Leah's maid. Issachar and Zebulun again to Leah. And finally Joseph and Benjamin to Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife. This distribution of sons across 4 mothers creates internal complexity within the household, foreshadowing the tensions and alliances that will characterize tribal relations in later periods. The competition between Leah and Rachel over fertility and affection underscores the human realities behind the formation of the tribes, grounding national identity in the messy struggles of family life. Jacob's prosperity under Laban, achieved through clever breeding of flocks, leads to tension and eventual separation. Jacob's return journey to Canaan is marked by one of the most enigmatic encounters in Hebrew tradition. On the night before meeting Esau, Jacob wrestles with a mysterious figure, described alternately as a man, an angel, or even God himself. The struggle lasts until dawn, leaving Jacob wounded in the hip but also transformed. He receives a new name, Israel, meaning he who strives with God, signifying his new identity as the patriarch of a people defined by struggle, persistence, and divine encounter. This moment crystallizes the transition from Jacob the individual to Israel the collective, whose descendants will bear his name. The reconciliation with Esau, though tense, defies expectations of violence, with the brothers embracing after years of enmity. Yet their paths diverge, with Esau becoming the ancestor of the Edomites, and Jacob continuing as the covenantal heir. The separation of lines reflects the broader reality of kinship groups in the ancient Near East, where related tribes often developed into distinct peoples with complex relationships of alliance, trade, and conflict. The Hebrews understood themselves as descended from Israel, distinct yet related to neighbouring groups such as the Edomites, Moabites, and Ammonites, all traced through kinship ties in their genealogical traditions. The narrative of Jacob's household emphasizes the role of Joseph, whose dreams and eventual rise in Egypt will shape the destiny of the entire family. His brothers' jealousy, their plot to sell him into slavery, and the deception of Jacob with Joseph's blooded coat highlight the dysfunction within the family, even as these actions lead to eventual preservation during famine. The tension between Joseph and his brothers reflects the broader challenges of unity among the tribes, where rivalry and betrayal coexist with shared identity and destiny. The 12 tribes of Israel, rooted in the sons of Jacob, emerge as a structural framework for the Hebrew people. Each tribe retains its distinct identity, associated with ancestral territories, symbols, and blessings, yet together they form a single nation bound by covenant. The blessings Jacob later pronounces upon his sons reflect both their individual characters and their tribal destinies, situating them within the larger narrative of Hebrew history. Judah is singled out as the line through which leadership will emerge, a theme that will find fulfillment in the Davidic monarchy. Levi is associated with priesthood. Simeon and Levi are recalled for their violence. Joseph is praised for his fruitfulness, and Benjamin for his fierceness. These tribal identities will play crucial roles in later periods, shaping the distribution of land, the dynamics of leadership, and the structures of worship. The patriarchal stories of Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes thus mark a transition from individual covenantal figures to a collective identity. Where Abraham represented the origin of covenant and Isaac its continuity, Jacob represents its expansion into a people. His name becomes synonymous with the nation, his sons with its tribal divisions, and his struggles with God with its ongoing history. The narrative emphasizes that Hebrew identity is not forged in isolation, but in the crucible of family conflict, migration, and divine encounter. The tribes that emerge from Jacob's household will carry the covenant into new contexts, first in Egypt, then in the wilderness, and finally in the land promised to Abraham. the patriarchal age, as embodied in Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes, reveals the interplay of divine promise and human imperfection. It shows how covenantal destiny is transmitted through flawed individuals, how national identity is built on family rivalries, and how divine faithfulness persists through generations. These stories preserve memory not only of ancestry, but of the values and struggles that define a people: faith, perseverance, resilience, and the constant striving with God that gives them their very name, Israel. From this foundation, the story moves inexorably toward the descent into Egypt, where the family of Israel will become a nation forged in the crucible of oppression and deliverance. The life of Joseph provides one of the most detailed personal narratives in the Hebrew tradition, stretching from the hills of Canaan into the heart of Egypt, where his story becomes the vehicle through which the entire family of Israel is transplanted into a new environment. The figure of Joseph occupies a unique place in Hebrew memory, combining elements of wisdom, suffering, and eventual exaltation. He is portrayed as the dreamer whose visions of future greatness provoke envy, the betrayed brother sold into slavery, the faithful servant who rises through hardship, and ultimately the saviour of his family in a time of famine. His life connects the patriarchal household of Jacob to the larger historical setting of Egypt, establishing the conditions that will later define Hebrew identity through both prosperity and oppression. The story begins in the fields of Canaan, where Jacob, now aged and surrounded by his large household, shows open favoritism to Joseph, the firstborn son of his beloved wife Rachel. The famous coat of many colours, or more precisely a richly ornamented robe, symbolises Joseph's special status, setting him apart from his brothers. This favoritism, combined with Joseph's dreams that predict his brothers bowing down to him, creates deep resentment. The family dynamics of rivalry, already evident in the competition between Leah and Rachel, now spill over into the next generation, culminating in betrayal. When Joseph approaches his brothers in the fields, they plot against him, stripping him of his robe and casting him into a pit before ultimately selling him to traders bound for Egypt. The deception of Jacob, with the bloodied robe presented as evidence of Joseph's death, mirrors earlier episodes of trickery within the family, showing that the cycle of deceit and rivalry continues to shape their destiny. In Egypt, Joseph's life takes on a new dimension. Sold into the household of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, he demonstrates diligence and skill, rising quickly in responsibility. Yet his success invites new trials, as Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him of attempted seduction, leading to his imprisonment. These reversals highlight the fragility of status in a foreign land, where the fate of an outsider depends on the whims of those in power. Even in prison, Joseph's gift of interpreting dreams sets him apart. His accurate interpretations for Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker pave the way for his eventual summons to Pharaoh himself, when the court is troubled by dreams of fat and lean cows, of full and withered ears of grain. Joseph's interpretation, foretelling 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, aligns with known cycles of Nile floods and agricultural variability in Egypt. Ancient Egyptian records preserve accounts of famines lasting multiple years, often tied to irregularities in the inundation of the Nile. Joseph's counsel to store grain during years of abundance reflects practical wisdom, transforming him from prisoner to vizier, second only to Pharaoh. His appointment illustrates how outsiders could rise in Egyptian administration, particularly those who brought valuable skills in dream interpretation and administration. The biblical account emphasizes that Joseph's rise is not merely the product of human talent, but of divine providence, positioning him as the instrument through whom both Egypt and his own family will be preserved. The famine that spreads across the region extends back to Canaan, forcing Jacob to send his sons to Egypt in search of grain. The encounter between Joseph and his brothers, unrecognized at first, becomes the dramatic climax of the narrative. Through a series of tests, accusations of spying, the imprisonment of Simeon, the demand for Benjamin's presence, the planting of a silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Joseph probes his brother's character, seeking to determine whether they have changed from the jealous betrayers who once sold him. Judah's plea to take Benjamin's place, offering himself as a substitute to spare their father the grief of losing another favoured son, demonstrates a transformation. The once selfish brothers now show loyalty and responsibility, marking a turning point in the family's story. The revelation of Joseph's identity, accompanied by weeping and reconciliation, brings healing to the fractured household. Joseph interprets his suffering in theological terms, telling his brothers that though they intended harm, God intended it for good, to preserve life. This perspective frames the migration of the Hebrews to Egypt not as an accident of famine or betrayal, but as part of a divine plan guiding their destiny. Joseph's invitation to settle in Egypt under Pharaoh's protection provides the family with security, while also setting the stage for their future enslavement. Jacob, upon learning that Joseph is alive, makes the journey to Egypt in his old age. On the way at Beersheba, he offers sacrifices and receives a vision, assuring him that this descent into Egypt is not a departure from the covenantal path, but part of it. The migration of the household, numbering 70 persons according to tradition, transforms the Hebrews from a family into a proto-nation transplanted into foreign soil. They are given the land of Goshen, a fertile region suitable for pastoralists, yet distinct from the Egyptian heartland. This separation allows them to preserve their identity while benefiting from Egyptian resources. Archaeological evidence indicates that groups of Asiatic peoples, often called Hyksos or Asiatics, settled in the eastern Nile Delta during the Middle and New Kingdoms, suggesting that the Hebrew migration fits into broader patterns of Semitic settlement in Egypt. The presence of Hebrews in Egypt creates new layers of cultural interaction. They adopt aspects of Egyptian life while maintaining distinct practices. The embalming and burial of Jacob in a manner consistent with Egyptian customs illustrates both assimilation and distinction, as Joseph ensures his father is buried back in Canaan at Machpelah, the ancestral tomb. This act symbolises that Egypt, while providing refuge, is not the final home of the Hebrews. The covenant promises remain tied to the land of Canaan, anchoring their identity despite their new location. Joseph's administration during the famine reshapes Egyptian society itself. The sale of grain to Egyptians, leading to the transfer of land and livestock to Pharaoh, reflects the centralization of power characteristic of Egyptian monarchy. Joseph is remembered not only as saviour, but also as architect of a new economic order, one that increased Pharaoh's control over land and labour. This detail aligns with broader patterns of Egyptian history, where famines often resulted in shifts of power toward the crown. The Hebrew tradition interprets this not primarily in political terms, but in theological ones, emphasizing that Joseph's wisdom preserved life. Yet the social consequences of these policies would later influence how Egyptians viewed foreign administrators and their peoples, setting the stage for future suspicion and oppression. The blessings of Jacob upon his sons, delivered shortly before his death, provide a final shaping of the tribal identities. Reuben is chastised for instability, Simeon and Levi for violence, Judah is elevated as leader, and Joseph receives abundant blessings reflecting his prominence. These blessings function as both personal evaluations and prophetic declarations, shaping the future of the tribes. The burial of Jacob in Canaan reaffirms the centrality of the Promised Land, even as his descendants remain in Egypt. The mourning of Jacob by both Hebrews and Egyptians illustrates the dual identity the family had begun to acquire, rooted in Canaanite ancestry but integrated into Egyptian society. Joseph's death marks the close of this phase. Like his father, he makes the Hebrews swear to carry his bones back to Canaan, signalling that their presence in Egypt is temporary. His embalming reflects Egyptian custom, yet his final request ties him irrevocably to the covenantal land. This duality, living in Egypt, buried in Canaan, captures the tension that will define Hebrew identity in the centuries to come. They are beneficiaries of Egypt's wealth, yet bound to promises beyond its borders. The migration of the Hebrews to Egypt represents both fulfillment and foreshadowing. Fulfillment, because the promise of descendants has expanded from a single family into a sizable group under divine protection, sustained in a time of famine. Foreshadowing, because their presence in a foreign land will soon shift from privilege to oppression, from prosperity to enslavement. The memory of Joseph's favour will fade, replaced by fear of their growing numbers and potential influence. The Hebrews, once welcomed as guests, will become viewed as a threat. Yet even this transformation will be interpreted as part of the divine plan, preparing the stage for deliverance through Moses and the shaping of a nation forged not only by covenant and family, but by suffering and liberation. The story of Joseph and the migration into Egypt thus completes the transition from patriarchal family narratives to the beginning of a collective national experience. It anchors Hebrew identity in both personal and historical dimensions, linking the struggles of one individual with the destiny of an entire people. From the betrayal by brothers to the rise in Pharaoh's court, from dreams of greatness to the preservation of nations during famine, Joseph's life illustrates how divine purposes operate through human weakness, suffering, and reconciliation. The Hebrews now settled in Egypt carry with them memories of covenant, promises of land, and the expectation that their destiny lies beyond the Nile, in the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their time in Egypt is only a stage necessary for growth, painful in its eventual outcome, but essential in shaping them into a people who will remember deliverance as the defining act of their history. The Hebrews' arrival in Egypt, initially a story of survival and prosperity under Joseph's influence, gradually transformed into a narrative of suspicion, oppression, and suffering. Time passed, and the memory of Joseph's service faded from Egyptian courts. A new pharaoh arose, described in the Hebrew account as one who did not know Joseph. This phrase captures not merely forgetfulness, but the shift of political context, where the presence of foreign groups in the Nile Delta, once tolerated or even welcomed, came to be seen as a potential threat. Egypt's long history of dealing with Asiatic peoples, including invasions by the Hyksos and constant pressures from Semitic migrants, created a climate of mistrust toward non-Egyptian populations. The Hebrews, settled in Goshen, had grown numerous, their distinct identity preserved even amid Egyptian society. What had begun as refuge became a source of anxiety for rulers intent on maintaining control. The narrative of Hebrew oppression must be situated within Egypt's broader historical context. Egyptian records describe waves of foreigners entering the eastern Nile Delta, some assimilated into labour forces, others forming distinct enclaves. The memory of the Hyksos, Semitic rulers who had once dominated northern Egypt, likely haunted later pharaohs, fueling suspicion that foreign populations could undermine Egyptian sovereignty. The Hebrews, with their growing numbers and potential ties to other Semitic groups across the Sinai and Levant, were perceived as a demographic and political risk. The biblical account describes Pharaoh's fear that in the event of war, the Hebrews might ally with Egypt's enemies. Whether or not this reflects a specific historical event, it captures the dynamic of a minority group whose size and separateness made them vulnerable to state control. The measures taken against the Hebrews began with forced labour. They were pressed into service-building store cities for Pharaoh, identified in the tradition as Pithom and Ramses. These projects correspond to Egypt's long-standing reliance on labour levies for construction, where both Egyptians and foreigners contributed to building temples, fortifications, and administrative centres. For the Hebrews, however, this labour took on the dimension of bondage, remembered not as civic duty, but as oppressive enslavement. The tasks of making bricks, carrying loads, and working in fields are depicted as gruelling, designed to break their spirit and limit their growth. Yet the narrative emphasises that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, highlighting the paradox of affliction producing resilience. When labour failed to curb their growth, Pharaoh escalated his policies to more brutal measures, commanding that Hebrew male infants be killed at birth. This act of infanticide reflects both desperation and cruelty, an attempt to cut off the lineage of a people by destroying their future. Yet resistance emerges in unexpected places. The Hebrew midwives, named Shiphrah and Puah, defy Pharaoh's orders, claiming that Hebrew women give birth too quickly for intervention. Their courage demonstrates that acts of quiet defiance can alter the course of history, preserving lives in the face of systemic oppression. The survival of Hebrew infants in this environment becomes itself an act of resistance, a testament to the determination of a people to endure. It is within this context of suffering and danger that the figure of Moses is introduced. His birth is framed against Pharaoh's decree, a child of the tribe of Levi hidden by his mother for 3 months. When concealment is no longer possible, she places him in a basket coated with pitch, setting him afloat on the Nile. The imagery recalls both desperation and hope, as the river that symbolized life in Egypt becomes the uncertain carrier of a child's destiny. The basket, or ark, echoes the earlier story of Noah, suggesting that just as humanity was preserved through an ark amid floodwaters, so the Hebrews would be preserved through this child delivered from the Nile. Moses' discovery by Pharaoh's daughter introduces irony into the narrative. The very household that sought to destroy Hebrew male children becomes the place where the deliverer is raised. The princess's compassion, coupled with the resourcefulness of Moses' sister, who arranges for their mother to nurse him, allows the child to survive and grow within both Hebrew and Egyptian worlds. He receives an Egyptian education, learning the language, culture, and administration of the royal court, while retaining his Hebrew identity through his earliest upbringing. This dual identity equips him for his future role, bridging 2 worlds as insider and outsider, prince and slave, Hebrew and Egyptian. The tradition of Moses' upbringing resonates with broader motifs of ancient Near Eastern literature, where heroes often face peril at birth and rise to prominence despite humble origins. Yet the Hebrew account frames Moses not as a figure of destiny by birthright, but as one chosen through divine providence. His very survival is miraculous, and his future role is shaped not by royal decree, but by the hand of God working through unlikely circumstances. Moses' awakening to his identity comes when he witnesses the suffering of his people. Seeing an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave, he intervenes and kills the oppressor, burying the body in the sand. This act, though motivated by justice, reveals the precariousness of his position. When the deed is discovered, he becomes a fugitive, rejected by both Egyptians and Hebrews, the former seeing him as a murderer, the latter questioning his authority. His flight into Midian marks the next stage of his life, a transition from privileged court life to exile in the wilderness. In Midian, Moses encounters Jethro, a priest, and marries his daughter Zipporah. He becomes a shepherd, leading flocks through the wilderness, a humble occupation far removed from the grandeur of Pharaoh's court. This period of exile mirrors the larger Hebrew experience, where suffering and displacement become the crucible of identity. It is in the wilderness, at Mount Horeb, that Moses encounters the defining revelation of his life. The burning bush, a flame yet unconsumed, introduces him to the God of his ancestors in a direct, overwhelming encounter. The divine voice identifies itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, linking Moses to the covenantal tradition. The revelation of the divine name, often rendered as Yahweh, marks a profound moment in Hebrew religious history, emphasizing God's eternal presence and active involvement in deliverance. Moses resists the call, protesting his inadequacy and lack of eloquence. Yet divine reassurance and the provision of his brother Aaron as spokesman overcome his reluctance. The staff in his hand transformed into a serpent and back again, symbolizes the power that will accompany him. The leprous hand healed and water turned to blood serve as signs of divine authority. Moses' return to Egypt, no longer as a prince but as a prophet, initiates the confrontation that will define Hebrew liberation. The oppression in Egypt and the birth of Moses thus represent both the lowest and the most hopeful points in Hebrew memory. The suffering under Pharaoh's decrees demonstrates the vulnerability of a people without political power, subject to the whims of rulers who saw them as threats. Yet the survival of infants, the defiance of midwives, and the preservation of Moses reveal the resilience and providence that sustain the Hebrews. The transition from Joseph's favoured status to Moses' dangerous mission illustrates the volatility of minority existence in foreign lands, where protection can turn to persecution in a single generation. This phase also sets the theological framework for what follows. The Hebrews will not be delivered by their own strength, nor by assimilation into Egyptian society, but by divine intervention through a chosen leader. Moses, born under threat of death, raised in the household of the oppressor, exiled in the wilderness, and called from a burning bush, embodies the paradox of weakness turned to strength, of exile turned to mission. His story prepares the way for the dramatic acts of deliverance that will define Hebrew identity, transforming them from a people of bondage into a nation of covenant. The suffering in Egypt, the cries of the oppressed, and the rise of a deliverer converge to create the conditions for the Exodus. This transition from bondage to liberation will not only shape Hebrew memory, but will become the defining paradigm of salvation, justice, and divine power for generations to come. The Hebrews, once welcomed as guests, now groan under forced labour and decrees of death. Yet in the midst of their affliction, a child has been born who will confront Pharaoh, reveal the power of the covenantal God, and lead them toward the land promised to their fathers. The call of Moses from the wilderness of Midian to return to Egypt begins the defining drama of Hebrew identity, the Exodus. This narrative, preserved in memory and ritual, became the central story that shaped how the Hebrews understood themselves, their God, and their destiny. The Exodus was not simply a departure from one land to another, but a transformation from servitude to nationhood, from scattered tribes under oppression to a people bound by covenant and law. Moses returns to Egypt accompanied by his brother Aaron, armed with signs of divine authority and a commission to confront Pharaoh. The encounter between Moses and Pharaoh symbolizes more than a political conflict. It represents a theological contest between the power of Egypt's gods and the power of the God of Israel. Pharaoh, embodying divine kingship in Egyptian ideology, refuses Moses' demand to let the Hebrews go, dismissing the God of the Hebrews as insignificant. His defiance sets the stage for a series of confrontations remembered as plagues, each of which undermines Egyptian religious and natural order. The plagues begin with water turned to blood, striking at the Nile, the source of Egypt's life and a symbol of divine power. Frogs, gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, and darkness follow, each disrupting the stability of Egyptian society and economy. Scholars have debated whether these plagues reflect natural disasters amplified in memory, or theological symbolism layered onto historical events. Regardless of their exact origin, the narrative presents them as escalating demonstrations of power, systematically dismantling Egypt's confidence in its gods. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, represents the ultimate blow, striking at the very heart of Egyptian society and Pharaoh's dynasty. The Hebrew account emphasizes that deliverance requires not only divine power, but also communal participation. The institution of the Passover becomes the ritual center of the Exodus story. Families are instructed to sacrifice a lamb, mark their doorpost with its blood, and eat the meal in haste, ready for departure. The blood on the doors signifies protection, as the plague of death passes over the Hebrew households. This act of obedience, carried out in the night of terror and liberation, creates a lasting memorial. Passover becomes the perpetual reminder of deliverance, embedding the memory of the Exodus into the rhythm of Hebrew life. The departure itself is framed as a hurried flight, with unleavened bread carried before it could rise, symbolizing readiness and urgency. The Hebrews, numbering in the thousands, leave Egypt accompanied by flocks, herds, and even some non-Hebrews who joined them, forming what is described as a mixed multitude. Their route has long been debated, with various traditions identifying different paths through the wilderness. The crossing of the sea, whether the Red Sea or a smaller body of water such as the Sea of Reeds, stands as the climactic moment. Pursued by Pharaoh's army, the Hebrews find themselves trapped, yet the waters are parted, allowing them to pass through on dry ground. When the Egyptians follow, the waters return, engulfing chariots and soldiers. This event, central to Hebrew memory, signifies the decisive act of divine deliverance, breaking the power of Pharaoh and securing the people's freedom. The Song of Deliverance, attributed to Moses and Miriam, celebrates the event with imagery of divine warrior triumphing over enemies. The crossing of the sea becomes the paradigm of salvation, remembered in later psalms and prophetic writings as the moment when God revealed unmatched power on behalf of his people. The Hebrews, no longer slaves, now stand as a free community, though their journey is only beginning. The wilderness that lies ahead will test their faith, shape their identity, and prepare them for covenantal responsibility. The journey to Sinai is marked by challenges that reveal both the fragility and resilience of the newly liberated people. Shortages of water and food provoke complaints, as the people recall the abundance of Egypt despite their oppression. Divine provision in the form of manna, quail, and water from the rock demonstrates ongoing care, while also teaching reliance on daily dependence. The battle with Amalek introduces the theme of external enemies who oppose the Hebrews in their vulnerable state. Through these trials, Moses emerges as mediator, interceding between the people and God, leading them not only physically but spiritually toward covenantal identity. The arrival at Mount Sinai represents the culmination of the Exodus, where liberation is joined to law and freedom is bound to covenant. The mountain itself is enveloped in cloud, fire, and trembling, emphasizing the awe-inspiring presence of the divine. The people are instructed to prepare, setting boundaries around the mountain, highlighting both the nearness and the danger of encountering holiness. At Sinai, the God who delivered them from Egypt now binds them to himself in a formal covenant, echoing the promises to Abraham but expanding them into a national framework. The covenant at Sinai is articulated in the giving of the 10 words, or 10 commandments, which serve as the foundational principles of Hebrew law. These commandments encompass loyalty to God, prohibitions against idolatry, instructions for Sabbath observance, and ethical directives concerning parents, life, marriage, property, and truth. Unlike other ancient law codes, which were often issued by kings to consolidate authority, the commandments are presented as direct divine speech, binding all members of the community equally. They emphasize both vertical obligations to God and horizontal obligations to neighbors, establishing a holistic vision of covenantal life. The covenant is sealed through ritual. Moses builds an altar, sacrifices are offered, and the people affirm their commitment with the words, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." Blood is sprinkled on both the altar and the people, signifying the binding nature of the agreement. The imagery recalls earlier covenantal ceremonies with Abraham but now extends to an entire nation. Israel is constituted as a covenant people, chosen not for privilege alone but for responsibility, called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, representing divine justice and holiness among the nations. The revelation at Sinai also includes detailed instructions for building the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that will house the divine presence during their wilderness journey. The Ark of the Covenant, with its mercy seat and cherubim, becomes the focal point of God's dwelling among his people. The tabernacle, with its structured spaces of holy and most holy, its priestly garments and sacrificial rituals, establishes the framework of worship that will continue into later temple traditions. The idea that the transcendent God chooses to dwell among the Hebrews, travelling with them in their journeys, reinforces the intimacy of covenant relationship. Yet even as the covenant is established, the fragility of the people's faith is exposed. While Moses is on the mountain receiving the law, the people construct a golden calf, proclaiming it as the God who delivered them from Egypt. This act of idolatry represents a profound betrayal, echoing the temptation to assimilate into surrounding cultures. Moses' intercession, his breaking of the tablets, and his plea for forgiveness highlight the tension between divine justice and mercy. The renewal of the covenant, following judgment and repentance, demonstrates that the relationship between God and Israel, though strained, endures. The covenant is not easily broken, for it is grounded not only in human commitment, but in divine faithfulness. The covenant at Sinai extends beyond law into a vision of identity and mission. The Hebrews are reminded that their deliverance was not for self-indulgence but for service. They are called to reflect divine holiness in their communal life, to embody justice in their treatment of the vulnerable, and to preserve fidelity in their worship. The laws concerning the poor, the stranger, the widow, and the orphan illustrate the ethical dimension of covenant, rooted in the memory of their own oppression in Egypt. The Sabbath, extending even to servants and animals, enshrines rest and equality into the fabric of society. The covenant creates a people distinct from Egypt, not in power or wealth, but in their way of life shaped by divine command. The journey from Egypt to Sinai thus represents a transformation in stages, from slaves to freed people, from freed people to covenant partners, from wanderers to a nation with law and worship. The Exodus is not complete until Sinai, for freedom without covenant would lead to chaos. The covenant provides structure, purpose, and identity, binding the Hebrews together as one people under God. The memory of the Exodus and Sinai becomes the central axis of Hebrew tradition. Passover, commemorating deliverance, the Feast of Weeks, later linked to the giving of the law, and the construction of the tabernacle, housing the presence, all embed this story into the rhythms of life. Prophets, psalmists, and teachers will continually recall these events as the foundation of faith, the paradigm of divine action in history. The God who brought them out of Egypt and spoke at Sinai remains the anchor of identity through exile, return, and renewal. The story does not end at Sinai, however. The covenantal people must now carry the law into the wilderness, confronting their weaknesses, rebellions, and doubts. The journey ahead will test their capacity to live out the responsibilities they have accepted, and their failures will reveal the tension between divine holiness and human frailty. Yet the memory of deliverance and covenant remains, shaping them into a people whose very existence testifies to a God who acts in history, who hears the cries of the oppressed, and who binds himself to a people not for their greatness but for his purpose. The covenant at Sinai marked a turning point in Hebrew history, but the story does not conclude with the dramatic revelation of law and the construction of the tabernacle. Instead, it enters a long period of wandering in the wilderness, a season that tested the community's faith, revealed its weaknesses, and simultaneously formed its lasting structures of worship, governance, and law. The wilderness years are remembered as a time of trial and discipline, yet also of provision and instruction. They illustrate the tension between deliverance already accomplished and fulfillment still awaited, between the promise of land and the reality of life in barren spaces. The Hebrews depart from Sinai with the tabernacle constructed, the covenant renewed, and the law given, but immediately the challenges of wilderness existence emerge. Hunger and thirst recur as themes, reflecting the precariousness of life outside the fertile lands of Egypt. Complaints become a consistent feature of the people's response, often directed at Moses and Aaron. The longing for Egypt, despite its bondage, highlights the psychological difficulty of transition from slavery to freedom. Freedom meant not only release from Pharaoh but also responsibility to live by covenantal law, and the weight of that responsibility often seemed heavier than chains of labour. Provision in the wilderness demonstrates divine faithfulness in the midst of human frailty. The manna, described as bread from heaven, appeared daily except on the Sabbath, teaching the people to depend on God's provision one day at a time. Quail provided meat when complaints arose, though accompanied by judgment to remind the people of their ingratitude. Water came from the rock at Moses' striking, illustrating both divine care and Moses' role as mediator. These provisions were not merely survival measures, but lessons in trust, teaching that covenant life depends on obedience and reliance on divine sustenance. The wilderness also brought external threats. Amalek attacked the Hebrews in their vulnerable state, initiating conflict that would echo through generations. The battle, remembered for Moses' raised hands ensuring victory, illustrated the dependence of military success not on numbers or strength alone, but on divine support mediated through leadership. Encounters with other tribes along the journey, whether hostile or cooperative, situated the Hebrews within the broader landscape of peoples inhabiting the wilderness and the borderlands of Canaan. Their identity was shaped not only internally by covenant, but externally by interactions with neighbours. Internally, the wilderness years revealed tensions of leadership and authority. Challenges arose not only from the people's complaints, but also from within the leadership structure. Miriam and Aaron questioned Moses' unique authority, leading to divine affirmation of his prophetic role. Korah and his followers staged a rebellion, asserting that the entire community was holy and questioning why Moses and Aaron held special status. The earth swallowing the rebels and the subsequent plagues that followed reinforced the necessity of divinely appointed leadership, while also highlighting the danger of pride and disobedience. These episodes underscored that covenantal community required both shared holiness and recognized order, with priestly and prophetic roles established by divine choice. The wilderness years also provided the setting for the elaboration of law. The initial commandments at Sinai were expanded into detailed instructions governing ritual, purity, justice, and daily life. The books of Leviticus and Numbers preserve much of this material, outlining sacrificial systems, priestly regulations, dietary laws, and social codes. These laws were not abstract rules, but practical instructions for shaping a distinct people. Dietary restrictions marked boundaries with surrounding cultures, distinguishing the Hebrews through practices that permeated daily life. Laws concerning purity and impurity emphasized the pervasive nature of holiness, extending into matters of health, childbirth, and bodily functions. The sacrificial system, with its categories of burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings, provided a structured means of maintaining covenant relationship through ritual. The priesthood, centered in the tribe of Levi and particularly in the descendants of Aaron, was established as mediators between the people and God. Their role included maintaining the tabernacle, conducting sacrifices, and teaching the law. The Levites, set apart without territorial inheritance, symbolized that holiness required dedicated service. Their provision through tithes and offerings highlighted the communal responsibility to support worship. The wilderness thus became the place where worship was formalized, leadership structured, and law codified. The giving of law extended into matters of justice and social order. Regulations concerning property, restitution, marriage, and inheritance established frameworks for community life. Provisions for the poor, the stranger, and the marginalized reflected the ethical dimension of covenant, rooted in the memory of Egypt. Festivals such as Passover, weeks, and booths were instituted as annual reminders of deliverance, harvest, and wilderness dwelling. These rhythms of time embedded covenant memory into the calendar, ensuring that generations would remember and reenact their story. Despite these provisions, the wilderness is remembered primarily as a time of failure. The most significant failure occurred when the Hebrews reached the threshold of Canaan. Spies sent to survey the land returned with reports of abundance, but also of formidable inhabitants and fortified cities. 10 of the 12 spies spread fear, claiming that the land was unconquerable, while only Joshua and Caleb affirmed that the promise could be trusted. The people's response was rebellion, expressing desire to return to Egypt rather than face the challenge. This lack of faith provoked divine judgment. The generation that left Egypt would not enter the promised land, but would wander for 40 years until a new generation arose. The wilderness thus became both punishment and preparation, a long delay caused by unbelief yet used to shape those who would inherit the promise. The years of wandering are marked by cycles of complaint, judgment, intercession, and renewal. Moses' role as intercessor is highlighted repeatedly, as he pleads for the people when divine wrath threatens destruction. His prayers emphasize the covenantal relationship and the reputation of God among the nations, arguing that destruction of the people would undermine the testimony of divine faithfulness. These intercessions reveal the dynamic nature of covenant, where human mediation and divine mercy intersect. The wilderness also exposes the frailty of leaders. Moses himself, though faithful, falters in a moment of frustration. When the people clamour for water again, God instructs him to speak to the rock, but Moses strikes it twice in anger, speaking words that diminish God's holiness. As a result, he is told that he will not enter the promised land. This judgment underscores that even the greatest leaders are accountable to the covenant, and that disobedience, however small it may seem, carries consequences. Moses' exclusion serves as a sobering reminder that covenant responsibility applies equally to all. Encounters with neighbouring peoples shape the wilderness experience as well. Edom refused passage through its territory, forcing detours. Moab and Midian posed both military and religious challenges, as seen in the episode of Balaam, the prophet summoned to curse Israel but compelled to bless instead. The seduction of Israelite men by Moabite women into idolatry at Baal Peor brought judgment, illustrating the constant danger of assimilation into surrounding religious practices. These interactions reinforce the need for vigilance in preserving covenant fidelity amid a pluralistic environment. As the years progressed, the new generation began to emerge, one not shaped by slavery in Egypt but by life in the wilderness. This generation experienced manna as normal, tabernacle worship as central, and the law as formative. They grew into a people distinct from Egypt and prepared for Canaan, though still prone to the weaknesses of their parents. The death of Miriam, Aaron, and eventually Moses marked the transition of leadership. Joshua, one of the faithful spies, was chosen to succeed Moses, symbolizing continuity and renewal. The wilderness years, though marked by wandering, were not wasted. They provided the context in which the Hebrews moved from a family of tribes bound by memory into a structured nation bound by law and worship. The tabernacle established the presence of God in their midst. The law codified their distinct identity. The priesthood provided mediation. Festivals embedded memory into time. Even failures served as lessons, reminding them of the consequences of unbelief and the necessity of trust. By the time the new generation stood again at the threshold of the land, they were no longer the fearful slaves who longed for Egypt, but a people shaped by 40 years of discipline. The wilderness remained in their memory as both a place of hardship and of divine intimacy, where God provided daily bread, dwelt among them, and revealed his holiness. Their identity as Israel was forged not only at Sinai, but in the long years of wandering, where covenant faithfulness was tested, sometimes failed, yet continually renewed. The formation of law in the wilderness ensured that when they entered Canaan, they would not be merely another tribal confederation, but a covenant people with a unique way of life. The land was promised, but possession required more than conquest. It required faithfulness to the covenant shaped in the wilderness. The years of trial had prepared them for that challenge, even as the memory of failure warned them of the dangers of rebellion. The wilderness thus stands as a paradoxical gift, a time of punishment that became a time of formation, a place of barrenness that became a place of identity. The Hebrews, having wandered for decades, now stood ready to cross into the land promised to their ancestors. The wilderness years, with all their failures and lessons, had forged them into a people capable of carrying the covenant forward. Under Joshua's leadership, they would move from wandering to conquest, from promise to possession, carrying with them the law, the tabernacle, and the memory of deliverance that had sustained them through the barren years. The generation that had grown up in the wilderness, nourished by manna and shaped by the law, now stood poised to enter the land long promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their leader was no longer Moses, who had gazed upon Canaan from the heights of Mount Nebo but was forbidden to cross, but Joshua, son of Nun, one of the faithful spies who had trusted the promise decades earlier. The transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua symbolized continuity of covenant, alongside renewal of purpose, as the people prepared not simply to migrate into new territory, but to establish themselves as a nation within it. The conquest and settlement of Canaan was not only a military campaign, but also a theological act, a fulfillment of promises, and a testing of covenant fidelity in the context of land, culture, and identity. The crossing of the Jordan River marked the beginning of this new phase, echoing the earlier crossing of the sea during the Exodus. Just as the waters of the Red Sea had parted to deliver the Hebrews from Egypt, so now the waters of the Jordan parted to grant them entry into Canaan. The priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the river and the waters stood still, allowing the people to cross on dry ground. 12 stones were taken from the riverbed and set up as a memorial, symbolizing the permanence of this moment in the memory of the tribes. This crossing emphasized continuity. The God who had delivered them from Pharaoh was the same God who now brought them into the land, and the ark, representing divine presence, led the way. The first major test came at Jericho, a fortified city standing as a symbol of Canaanite strength. Rather than conventional military assault, the Hebrews were instructed to march around the city once each day for 6 days, with priests blowing trumpets before the ark, and on the 7th day to circle it 7 times before releasing a great shout. The walls fell, and the city was taken. This narrative emphasizes that conquest depended not on military power, but on divine intervention, reinforcing the covenantal nature of possession. The sparing of Rahab, a Canaanite woman who had sheltered Hebrew spies, illustrates that inclusion into Israel was possible for outsiders who aligned themselves with the covenant God, even as the general destruction of the city symbolized judgment on Canaanite society. The conquest was not without setbacks. At Ai, initial defeat revealed the consequences of disobedience. Achan, one of the Hebrews, had taken forbidden spoils from Jericho, violating the divine command. His sin brought defeat on the entire community, illustrating the corporate dimension of covenant responsibility. After judgment and purification, Ai was captured, demonstrating that obedience was the key to success. These episodes reinforced that possession of the land was contingent not simply on military action, but on covenant fidelity. Joshua's campaigns extended through central, southern and northern Canaan, with victories over coalitions of kings. The destruction of Hazor, a major northern city, is particularly noted. Archaeological evidence indicates that Hazor experienced destruction in the Late Bronze Age, aligning with the memory of conquest, though the extent and nature of the campaigns remain debated among historians. Some argue for rapid military conquest, others for gradual infiltration or peasant uprisings within Canaanite society. Whatever the historical mechanics, the Hebrew tradition preserves the memory of decisive victories attributed to divine power rather than human strategy. The covenant was renewed at Shechem, where blessings and curses were proclaimed, echoing the covenant at Sinai but now rooted in the land itself. The people were reminded that possession depended on obedience, and disobedience would lead to loss. The land was not merely a gift but a trust, conditional upon covenant faithfulness. This principle would shape Hebrew history, as later prophets interpreted exile and suffering as consequences of covenant violation. The settlement of the land involved distribution among the 12 tribes, each receiving a portion of territory. Judah, Ephraim and Manasseh emerged as dominant, while smaller tribes occupied peripheral areas. The Levites, as priests, received no territorial inheritance but were given cities scattered throughout the land, reinforcing their role as spiritual leaders unbound to specific territory. Cities of refuge were established, places where those accused of manslaughter could find protection, reflecting the legal framework shaped in the wilderness, now applied in settled life. The settlement process was gradual and incomplete. While some cities were destroyed, others remained in Canaanite control, and many Hebrews lived alongside Canaanite populations. The tradition itself acknowledges that not all land was conquered, and that Canaanite influence persisted. This coexistence would become a source of temptation and conflict, as the Hebrews struggled to maintain distinct identity amid the cultural and religious practices of their neighbours. The covenant had demanded the removal of idolatry, but in practice, assimilation and compromise often occurred. The book of Joshua concludes with the assembly at Shechem, where Joshua exhorts the people to choose whom they will serve, declaring, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The people affirm their commitment, renewing the covenant once more. Joshua's death marks the end of an era, with the land largely subdued, but the task of faithfulness still ahead. The conquest had provided territory, but settlement required continual vigilance against compromise. The conquest and settlement of Canaan must be understood as both historical memory and theological statement. Historically, it reflects the transition of a semi-nomadic people into agrarian and territorial life, entering a land dominated by city-states and agricultural economies. Theologically, it reflects the fulfillment of promises to the patriarchs, demonstrating that the God who delivered them from Egypt also gave them the land. The conquest narratives emphasize divine sovereignty, covenant responsibility, and the dangers of disobedience. The settlement of the land introduced new challenges. Life in Canaan required adaptation to agriculture, integration with local economies, and negotiation of coexistence with remaining Canaanites. It demanded that covenant law, given in the wilderness, be lived out in new circumstances. The memory of conquest reinforced the identity of the Hebrews as a chosen people, distinct from their neighbours, yet their proximity to those neighbours created constant tension. The land, gift and trust, blessing and challenge, would shape Hebrew history in profound ways. The conquest under Joshua thus represents both achievement and beginning. The Hebrews had entered the land, established tribal territories and renewed the covenant, yet the incomplete nature of settlement, the persistence of Canaanite influence, and the challenge of maintaining fidelity ensured that their story would continue, marked not only by victory, but by cycles of faithfulness and failure. The land promised to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob was now in their possession, but its permanence would depend on covenant loyalty, a lesson that the generations after Joshua would struggle to learn. With the death of Joshua, the generation that had directly experienced the conquest of Canaan and the renewal of the covenant at Shechem began to fade, and the Hebrew people entered a new phase in their history. This period, remembered as the time of the Judges, stretched across several centuries and was characterized not by centralized kingship or unified administration, but by a loose tribal confederation held together by shared memory of covenant and occasional leaders raised up in times of crisis. The Judges era reveals both the resilience of Hebrew identity and its vulnerability to compromise, as cycles of apostasy, oppression, deliverance, and relapse define their life in the land. The conquest under Joshua had secured territory, but it had not eliminated the presence of Canaanite populations, city-states, and cultural influences. Many Canaanite strongholds remained unconquered, and the Hebrews often lived in close proximity to their neighbours. This coexistence created both opportunities for trade and constant temptation to adopt local religious practices. the covenant demanded exclusive loyalty to the God of Israel, prohibiting idolatry and the worship of Baal, Asherah, and other deities of fertility and storm. Yet the agricultural lifestyle of Canaan, dependent on rain and seasonal cycles, made Canaanite religion attractive, promising prosperity through rituals that integrated fertility cults into everyday life. The struggle to remain distinct, resisting assimilation, defined the period of the Judges. The narrative framework of the Judges era follows a recurring pattern. The people turn away from covenant fidelity and adopt Canaanite practices, provoking divine anger. As judgment, neighbouring peoples are allowed to oppress them, subjugating them militarily or economically. In their distress, the Hebrews cry out, and God raises up a judge, a charismatic leader who delivers them from their enemies. For a time, peace is restored, but once the judge dies, the cycle begins again, with apostasy leading to oppression, oppression to deliverance, and deliverance back to apostasy. This cycle underscores the fragility of Hebrew faithfulness and the enduring patience of divine mercy, as deliverance is granted repeatedly despite repeated failure. The judges themselves were not kings or dynastic rulers, but temporary leaders, often arising from unexpected backgrounds. Their authority derived not from hereditary succession, but from charisma and divine empowerment. They served as military leaders, arbiters of disputes, and at times prophets, guiding the people in moments of crisis. Their stories, preserved in tradition, illustrate both the strengths and weaknesses of leadership during this era. Othniel, the first judge mentioned, represents the model of deliverance, raised up to defeat foreign oppressors and restore peace. Ehud, a left-handed Benjamite, assassinated the Moabite king Eglon with a hidden dagger, demonstrating cunning and courage in liberating his people. Deborah, one of the most remarkable figures of the period, served as both prophetess and judge, leading Israel alongside Barak in a decisive victory over Canaanite forces led by Sisera. Her song, one of the oldest Hebrew poems, celebrates the triumph as divine intervention and highlights the role of women in leadership and deliverance. Gideon, called from obscurity while threshing wheat in secret, embodies the paradox of weakness transformed by divine power. Initially hesitant, he tested his call with the famous fleece, yet went on to lead a small band of 300 men to victory over the Midianites, demonstrating that deliverance depended on God rather than numbers. Yet Gideon's later actions, including the making of an ephod that became a snare of idolatry, reveal the dangers of compromise even among deliverers. Jephthah, another judge, illustrates the complexity of leadership, rising from rejection as an outcast to military leadership, but remembered for his tragic vow that led to the sacrifice of his daughter. These narratives reveal that the judges were not flawless heroes, but flawed instruments through whom deliverance came. The most famous judge, Samson, represents both strength and weakness in dramatic form. Set apart from birth as a Nazirite, he was endowed with extraordinary physical power, defeating Philistines with feats of might. Yet his weakness for women, particularly Delilah, led to his downfall, as his hair was cut and his strength lost. Blinded and humiliated, Samson ultimately brought down the temple of Dagon upon himself and his enemies, dying in a final act of deliverance. His story illustrates both the danger of personal weakness and the reality that divine purposes can work through even the most flawed individuals. The period of the Judges was also marked by internal conflict among the tribes. Civil war erupted between Benjamin and the other tribes after a horrific crime in Gibeah, nearly annihilating the tribe. These episodes reveal the fragility of tribal unity and the absence of central authority capable of maintaining order. The repeated refrain, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes," captures the instability of the period. The lack of centralized leadership allowed for local autonomy, but also led to fragmentation and vulnerability. Theological themes dominate the memory of the Judges era. The cycle of apostasy and deliverance emphasizes that covenant unfaithfulness brings consequences, yet divine mercy remains available when the people repent. The judges themselves embody the principle that God raises deliverers not from established elites but from unexpected quarters, working through weakness and diversity. The failures of both people and leaders highlight the need for a more permanent solution, a longing for stability that will eventually find expression in the demand for kingship. Archaeological evidence from this period supports a picture of gradual settlement and local conflicts rather than sweeping conquest. Small villages appeared in the Central Highlands during the Iron Age Dyn, consistent with the emergence of a new people distinct from Canaanite urban centres. These settlements were often modest, with little evidence of monumental architecture, reflecting a society of tribal groups rather than centralised states. The Hebrew identity during this period was forged not through empire, but through shared traditions, covenant memory, and periodic deliverance in times of crisis. The Judges period also reveals the complexity of Hebrew interaction with neighbouring peoples. Moabites, Midianites, Ammonites, and Philistines all feature as oppressors at different times. These interactions were not merely military but cultural, as trade, intermarriage, and religious influence flowed across boundaries. The constant temptation to adopt Canaanite religious practices illustrates the porousness of cultural identity and the difficulty of maintaining exclusivity in a pluralistic environment. The covenant demanded distinctiveness, but the realities of life in Canaan made compromise an ever-present risk. The stories of the Judges are not only political or military accounts, but moral and theological reflections on human weakness and divine faithfulness. They preserve memory of individuals who rose in times of crisis, sometimes with great courage, sometimes with tragic flaws. They illustrate the dangers of disunity, idolatry, and moral decline, while also affirming that deliverance was possible even in the darkest times. The period serves as both a warning and a preparation, showing the consequences of living without centralized authority and the need for a more enduring form of leadership. By the end of the Judges era, the Hebrews had established themselves in Canaan, but remained fragmented and vulnerable. Their tribal confederation lacked cohesion, and their cycles of apostasy revealed persistent weakness. The longing for stability and unity would soon lead to the demand for a king, a request that would transform their political and religious landscape. The Judges period thus stands as a transitional era, preserving the memory of divine deliverance amid human failure, shaping the identity of Israel as a people who survived not through their own strength, but through the mercy of the God who raised up leaders in their times of need. The instability of the Judges period, with its cycles of apostasy, foreign oppression and internal strife, created both a sense of longing and necessity for a more permanent and centralized form of leadership. The refrain that everyone did what was right in his own eyes expressed the fragmentation of tribal society, where local autonomy meant freedom, but also disunity, lawlessness, and vulnerability. In this environment, the demand for a king arose, marking a decisive transformation in Hebrew political and religious life. The monarchy would bring unity, military strength, and administrative organization, but it would also introduce new tensions as covenantal ideals of divine sovereignty intersected with the realities of human rule. The transition to monarchy is framed in the figure of Samuel, the last of the judges and the first of the prophets in a new sense. Samuel's life begins with his mother Hannah, whose prayer for a child is answered in his birth. She dedicates him to service in the sanctuary at Shiloh, where he grows under the priest Eli. His call as a child, hearing the divine voice in the night, symbolizes the new era of prophetic leadership, where communication from God becomes central to guiding the people. Samuel combines roles of judge, priest, and prophet, leading militarily against the Philistines, offering sacrifices, and delivering divine messages. His leadership brings temporary stability, but his advancing age and the corruption of his sons create pressure for a more enduring solution. The people's request for a king represents both practical concerns and theological tension. On one hand, they desire a leader who can unify the tribes, provide consistent military defense against enemies such as the Philistines, and offer centralized administration. On the other hand, the request is interpreted as a rejection of divine kingship, as the Hebrews were intended to be distinct, ruled directly by their covenant God rather than by human monarchs like surrounding nations. Samuel warns of the dangers of monarchy, predicting that kings will impose taxes, conscript labour, seize property, and reduce the people to servitude. These warnings reflect the realities of ancient Near Eastern kingship, where centralised power often came at the expense of popular freedom. Yet the people persist, and God instructs Samuel to grant their request, affirming that monarchy will be incorporated into the covenantal framework, though not without consequences. The first king chosen is Saul, a Benjaminite, tall and impressive in stature, reflecting the people's desire for a leader who appeared strong in the eyes of nations. His initial anointing by Samuel and subsequent public selection demonstrate both divine choice and popular affirmation. Saul's early reign includes military victories over the Ammonites and Philistines, establishing him as a capable deliverer. His success generates enthusiasm and unites the tribes under his leadership. Yet from the beginning, Saul's reign reveals the tension between obedience to covenant law and the demands of kingship. Saul's first major failure occurs when he presumes to offer sacrifices in Samuel's absence, overstepping his authority and disregarding divine command. Later, his incomplete obedience in the war against Amalek, sparing King Agag and the best of the livestock despite instructions to destroy everything, leads to Samuel's declaration that God has rejected him as king. These episodes illustrate the central theme of obedience. Kingship is acceptable only insofar as it aligns with covenant fidelity. Saul's downfall is not framed primarily in political terms but in theological ones, highlighting the principle that even kings are subject to divine law. The deterioration of Saul's reign is marked by increasing instability, jealousy and estrangement from Samuel. His troubled spirit, soothed temporarily by David's music, symbolizes his loss of divine favor. His obsession with David, whom he perceives as a rival, leads to paranoia and repeated attempts to kill him. Saul's decline reveals the dangers of monarchy unmoored from covenant faithfulness, where personal insecurity and disobedience undermine both divine approval and political stability. His tragic end, falling on his own sword in battle against the Philistines, underscores the consequences of failed leadership, leaving Israel vulnerable and leaderless once more. Yet even as Saul falters, the transition to a new model of kingship is prepared through Samuel's anointing of David, a shepherd from Bethlehem, son of Jesse, of the tribe of Judah. David's rise will reshape Hebrew history, establishing the monarchy not merely as political necessity, but as covenantal institution. For now, however, Saul represents the birth of the monarchy in all its complexity, a response to real needs, shaped by divine concession, but fraught with tension between human ambition and divine sovereignty. The broader context of the Judges and early monarchy period reveals the pressures that made kingship almost inevitable. The Philistines, equipped with iron weaponry and organised military structures, posed a constant threat in the coastal plain, pressing into the central highlands. Their control of key trade routes and advanced technology placed them in a dominant position, and the fragmented Hebrew tribes struggled to resist them effectively. A unified monarchy offered the possibility of coordinated military defence and access to the resources necessary to challenge such powers. Thus, the demand for a king reflected both existential necessity and cultural influence. The surrounding nations all had monarchs who embodied stability and strength. The birth of the monarchy under Saul illustrates the balance between human initiative and divine purpose. The people requested a king, and God permitted it, but the king was expected to rule under covenantal constraints. This principle distinguishes Hebrew monarchy from other Near Eastern systems, where kings often claim divine status or absolute authority. In Israel, the king remained subject to divine law and prophetic accountability. Samuel's role in anointing, guiding, and rebuking Saul demonstrates that prophets served as checks on royal power, ensuring that monarchy did not replace divine sovereignty. This dynamic would continue throughout Hebrew history, with prophets confronting kings when they strayed from covenant faithfulness. The early monarchy thus begins with both promise and warning. Saul's victories against enemies provide immediate security and unity, fulfilling the people's desire for leadership. Yet his failures highlight the dangers inherent in kingship. Disobedience, pride, and insecurity can undermine divine favour and national stability. The transition from tribal confederation to monarchy represents a decisive step in Hebrew history, shaping their identity as a nation among nations, but also introducing new challenges in balancing covenant ideals with political realities. As Saul's reign unravels, the stage is set for the rise of David, whose kingship will redefine the monarchy and establish Jerusalem as the political and religious centre of Hebrew life. But the memory of Saul remains as a cautionary tale, reminding future generations that kingship, though necessary, is no substitute for covenant faithfulness. The birth of the monarchy, embodied in Samuel's prophetic leadership and Saul's troubled reign, reveals the tension between human desire for stability and the divine demand for obedience, a tension that would shape the destiny of Israel throughout its history. The collapse of Saul's reign and his tragic death in battle left a vacuum in leadership at a time when Israel faced constant threats from the Philistines and internal divisions among the tribes. Into this void stepped David, the young shepherd from Bethlehem, already known for his skill in music, his courage in battle, and his anointing by Samuel as the one chosen to succeed Saul. The rise of David marks a decisive transformation in Hebrew history, for his kingship not only united the tribes politically, but also reshaped their religious and cultural identity, centering it in Jerusalem and laying the foundation for a dynasty that would dominate their imagination for centuries. David's early life and his introduction to national prominence came through his confrontation with Goliath, the Philistine giant who challenged Israel's armies. Though the account is coloured by legendary elements, its theological meaning is clear. Victory does not depend on human strength or military power, but on trust in the God of Israel. David's defeat of Goliath with a sling and a stone epitomizes the principle that the weak, when empowered by faith, can overcome the mighty. This theme, repeated in his subsequent rise, reinforced the idea that David's success was rooted not in personal ambition alone, but in divine election. David's relationship with Saul provides one of the most dramatic narratives of the early monarchy. Initially welcomed into Saul's court as a musician to soothe the king's troubled spirit, and later as a warrior whose victories brought acclaim, David quickly became a figure of both admiration and jealousy. Saul's growing paranoia led to repeated attempts on David's life, forcing him into a life of exile and flight. During this period, David gathered around him a band of loyal followers, often men marginalized by society, creating a personal retinue that would later form the nucleus of his power. His time in the wilderness honed his leadership, teaching him to navigate alliances, conflicts, and survival outside formal structures of authority. Despite Saul's hostility, David consistently refrained from taking Saul's life when given the chance, emphasizing his respect for the principle of divine anointing. This restraint distinguished David as a leader who, despite ambition, understood kingship as a divine trust rather than mere political opportunity. His lament at Saul and Jonathan's deaths, preserved as a poetic elegy, illustrates his capacity for loyalty, grief, and recognition of Saul's stature despite their conflict. These qualities contributed to the perception of David as a man after God's own heart, chosen not for perfection, but for his orientation toward divine purposes. David's path to kingship was gradual. Following Saul's death, he was first recognized as king over Judah, ruling from Hebron for 7 years. The northern tribes, however, initially followed Ishbosheth, Saul's son, leading to a period of conflict and civil war. Gradually, through both political maneuvering and military success, David consolidated power, and eventually all the tribes acknowledged him as king. This unification represented a significant shift from tribal confederation to centralized monarchy, providing the foundation for stability and expansion. The capture of Jerusalem became David's most decisive political and symbolic act. At the time, Jerusalem was a Jebusite city, strategically located on a hill between the territories of Judah and Benjamin. By capturing it, David established a neutral political centre, not previously controlled by any tribe, avoiding favoritism and providing a unifying capital. Jerusalem's location on defensible terrain and its access to water made it practical, while its symbolic power as a new centre made it ideal for consolidating national identity. Renamed the City of David, Jerusalem became not only the political capital, but also the religious heart of Israel, a transformation that would define Hebrew history thereafter. David further solidified Jerusalem's centrality by bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city. The Ark, symbolizing divine presence and covenant memory, had long been housed at Shiloh and later moved during battles, but by transferring it to Jerusalem, David aligned the political and religious centers. The procession of the Ark, accompanied by music, dancing, and sacrifices, dramatized the fusion of divine presence with David's kingship. This act elevated Jerusalem from a neutral political capital to the sacred heart of Hebrew identity, a place where the presence of God and the throne of the king were intertwined. David's reign was marked by military expansion and consolidation. He defeated the Philistines, securing Israel's independence from their domination. Victories over Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Aram extended Israel's influence across the region, transforming the Hebrews from a vulnerable tribal confederation into a significant regional power. Tribute from surrounding states, strategic alliances, and control of trade routes brought wealth and stability. The United Kingdom under David represented the height of Hebrew political strength up to that point, with boundaries extending from the Mediterranean coast to the edges of the desert, and from the Negev in the south to the approaches of the Euphrates in the north. Yet David's reign was not without internal challenges. The narrative of his sin with Bathsheba and the arranged death of her husband Uriah reveals both the moral weaknesses of the king and the theological principle that no one, not even the anointed monarch, is above divine law. The prophet Nathan's confrontation with David, using a parable to expose his guilt, demonstrates the continuing role of prophetic authority as a check on royal power. David's repentance, expressed in psalms of lament and confession, illustrates his responsiveness to divine correction, distinguishing him from Saul, who had rationalized his disobedience. The episode, however, brought lasting consequences within his household, as conflict and rebellion marked the later years of his reign. The rebellion of Absalom, David's own son, represented the most severe internal crisis. Charismatic and ambitious, Absalom won popular support, forcing David to flee Jerusalem. The conflict culminated in battle, with Absalom killed despite David's explicit orders to spare him. David's grief at his son's death, expressed in the anguished cry, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you," reveals the tension between his role as king and his role as father. The rebellion exposed the fragility of dynastic stability, even under a strong and divinely favoured ruler. Despite these personal and political struggles, David succeeded in establishing the framework of monarchy that endured beyond his lifetime. His covenant with God, often referred to as the Davidic covenant, promised that his dynasty would endure and that his throne would be established forever. This covenant, articulated through the prophet Nathan, elevated David's kingship beyond political institution to theological cornerstone. The belief that God had bound himself to David's line shaped later expectations of messianic hope, as generations looked to the promise of a king who would restore justice, peace, and divine favour. David also contributed significantly to Hebrew culture and worship. He is remembered as the sweet psalmist of Israel, associated with the composition of hymns, laments, and prayers that became central to Hebrew worship. Whether or not he personally authored all the psalms attributed to him, his association with the psalms reflects the enduring impact of his role in shaping liturgical expression. His integration of music, poetry, and worship into national identity ensured that the spiritual life of Israel was as central as its political and military life. The United Kingdom under David thus represents the apex of Hebrew identity in the early monarchy. The tribes, once fragmented and prone to cycles of apostasy, were united under a single ruler. Jerusalem, once a Canaanite stronghold, became the sacred and political capital. Military victories secured independence and expansion. Covenant theology deepened with the promise of enduring dynasty. Worship was centralized, and psalms gave voice to the people's devotion. Yet the story also illustrates the ongoing tension between divine sovereignty and human frailty, as David's sins and family conflicts reveal that even the greatest king was subject to weakness and judgment. The legacy of David would overshadow all future kings. His reign became the standard by which successors were measured, his covenant the foundation of hope, and his city the centre of worship. The memory of his victories, his psalms, and his covenantal promise endured even through later periods of division and exile. The United Kingdom under David was both a historical reality and a theological symbol, embodying the ideal of unity under divine rule, even as its fragility foreshadowed the challenges that would come. The story now turns towards Solomon, David's son, whose reign would continue the United Kingdom, expand its wealth and influence, and build the temple in Jerusalem. Yet Solomon's reign, for all its splendour, would also carry the seeds of division that would fracture the kingdom after his death. The United Kingdom, glorious in the time of David and Solomon, would prove temporary, a reminder that human kingship, however divinely blessed, remained vulnerable to the failings of rulers and the fickleness of people. The death of David marked the close of a turbulent but foundational era in Hebrew history, and the succession of Solomon, his son, by Bathsheba, opened a new chapter defined by peace, prosperity, and monumental achievement. Where David's reign had been marked by war, conquest, and the consolidation of power, Solomon's reign was remembered for stability, wealth, wisdom, and the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, the permanent sanctuary that would embody Hebrew worship for centuries. Solomon inherited both the strengths and weaknesses of his father's legacy, a united kingdom with expanding influence, but also internal rivalries and external pressures. His reign represents the height of Israelite power, yet also carries the seeds of decline as prosperity and foreign influence drew the people toward compromise and division. The succession of Solomon was not without conflict. Adonijah, another of David's sons, attempted to claim the throne, supported by some of David's officials. The intervention of Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan secured Solomon's anointing, with David affirming him as heir before his death. This contested succession illustrates the fragility of dynastic stability in a monarchy still relatively new. Solomon's consolidation of power required decisive action. Adonijah was executed, and other rivals or disloyal figures were removed. With internal threats neutralized, Solomon established himself firmly as king, continuing David's legacy while charting his own path. Solomon's reign is remembered for his wisdom, a quality celebrated in biblical tradition and admired in later memory. The famous story of the two women claiming the same child, resolved by Solomon's proposal to divide the infant, highlights his ability to discern truth and administer justice. His reputation for wisdom extended beyond Israel, attracting visitors from surrounding nations, most famously the Queen of Sheba, who brought gifts and marvelled at his court. Wisdom literature, including Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, has been traditionally associated with Solomon, reflecting the perception of his reign as a golden age of intellectual and spiritual reflection. Whether or not Solomon personally authored these works, their association with him underscores the memory of his reign as one of cultural flourishing. the most significant achievement of Solomon's reign was the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. David had long desired to build a permanent house for the Ark of the Covenant, but the task was left to his son. Solomon undertook the project with immense resources, drawing on skilled labour, imported materials and international alliances. Cedar wood came from Lebanon through an alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre. Skilled craftsmen were recruited for intricate work in stone, metal and wood. The temple was constructed on Mount Moriah, the site traditionally associated with Abraham's binding of Isaac, adding layers of symbolic meaning. The temple became the central focus of Hebrew worship, replacing the portable tabernacle used during the wilderness years. Its structure included the outer courts, the holy place, and the innermost holy of holies, where the ark was placed. Cherubim overshadowed the ark, and the presence of God was understood to dwell there in a unique way. Sacrifices, festivals, and prayers were now centered in Jerusalem, establishing both religious and political centralization. The dedication of the temple, accompanied by Solomon's prayer, emphasized that even though heaven could not contain God, the temple would serve as a place where prayers were heard and covenant was remembered. This act solidified Jerusalem's status not only as the political capital, but also as the spiritual heart of the nation. The construction of the temple also reflected Israel's integration into the broader world of Near Eastern monumental architecture. Temples in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan were built to house gods and symbolize cosmic order, and Solomon's temple reflected similar patterns while embodying Hebrew distinctiveness. It housed no image of God, reflecting the prohibition of idolatry, and instead emphasized divine presence through the ark and covenantal memory. Its grandeur demonstrated Israel's emergence as a significant kingdom, capable of undertaking projects on par with surrounding nations. Solomon's reign was also marked by extensive building beyond the temple. He fortified cities, constructed palaces, developed administrative centers, and expanded infrastructure. The scale of his projects required labor and resources, leading to the use of conscripted labor from both Israelites and subject peoples. While these projects symbolized prosperity, they also placed heavy burdens on the population, creating tensions that would later contribute to division. Economically, Solomon's reign benefited from strategic trade routes linking Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. His alliances with Tyre and other states facilitated maritime trade, bringing wealth from distant lands. The biblical account describes imports of gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks, reflecting both prosperity and cosmopolitanism. Tribute from subject states and taxation from within the kingdom enriched the treasury, enabling lavish construction and court life. The description of Solomon's throne, adorned with gold and ivory, and his daily provisions measured in vast quantities, emphasizes the opulence of his reign. Militarily, Solomon maintained security through alliances rather than conquest. His marriage alliances with foreign princesses, including Pharaoh's daughter, symbolized diplomatic ties. While these marriages strengthened political connections, they also introduced foreign religious practices into Israel. The biblical tradition criticizes Solomon for permitting his foreign wives to build shrines to their deities, leading to idolatry within the kingdom. This compromise illustrates the tension between political pragmatism and covenantal fidelity, foreshadowing future decline. The height of Solomon's power was thus accompanied by subtle cracks. The burden of taxation and forced labor created discontent, particularly in the northern tribes. The centralization of worship in Jerusalem, while unifying, also marginalized local shrines, creating tension between central authority and regional traditions. The accommodation of foreign cults undermined the exclusivity of covenant worship, threatening the distinctiveness of Hebrew identity. These tensions would surface dramatically after Solomon's death, when the United Kingdom fractured. Theologically, Solomon's reign represented both fulfillment and warning. The temple fulfilled the promise of a permanent dwelling for God's name, establishing a center of worship that embodied covenantal presence. The prosperity and wisdom of the reign reflected divine blessing. Yet the warnings of Deuteronomy that kings should not accumulate excessive wealth, wives or horses, were ignored, and the compromises that accompanied prosperity revealed the dangers of success. The same reign remembered as the height of Israelite power also sowed the seeds of decline, illustrating the paradox that blessing can lead to forgetfulness of the source of blessing. Solomon's legacy endured through the temple, which became the focal point of Hebrew worship until its destruction centuries later, and through the memory of his wisdom celebrated in literature and tradition. Yet his reign also marked the end of unity. His death opened the way for division, as the burdens he imposed and the compromises he tolerated created conditions that fractured the kingdom. The united monarchy, glorious under David and Solomon, would soon split into rival states of Israel and Judah, each struggling to maintain identity and survival in a world of powerful empires. The height of Israelite power under Solomon was thus both a climax and a turning point. The temple stood as a symbol of covenant presence, wisdom literature flourished, and wealth and influence reached new levels. But beneath the splendour lay the fragility of human kingship, subject to compromise, burden, and division. The story of Solomon, like that of David before him, reveals that covenantal destiny is fulfilled not through human greatness alone, but through faithfulness to divine purposes, a lesson that the divided kingdoms would struggle to learn in the centuries to come. The death of Solomon marked both the end of Israel's golden age and the beginning of one of its most painful realities, division. For a generation, under David and Solomon, the tribes had experienced the benefits of unity, centralized worship, and national strength. But beneath the surface, the burdens of Solomon's reign had created cracks in the foundation of the united monarchy. His heavy taxation, forced labour policies, and the accommodation of foreign religious practices left many of the northern tribes resentful and alienated. With Solomon's death, the fragile unity he had held together unravelled, and the kingdom split into two rival states, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This division would shape Hebrew history for centuries, leading to political instability, religious divergence, and vulnerability to the empires that surrounded them. The immediate cause of the division came in the reign of Rehoboam, Solomon's son and successor. When he went to Shechem to be confirmed as king, representatives from the northern tribes confronted him with a request: lighten the burdens imposed by his father, and they would serve him faithfully. Rehoboam consulted advisers. The older councillors urged caution, advising him to show leniency and win the people's loyalty. The younger councillors, however, counselled harshness, urging him to assert dominance by increasing the burden. Rehoboam chose the latter, declaring that his little finger was thicker than his father's waist, and that he would discipline the people with scorpions rather than whips. His arrogance and disregard for the people's grievances triggered open rebellion. The northern tribes, rejecting the house of David, rallied behind Jeroboam, a former official under Solomon who had earlier rebelled and fled to Egypt for refuge. Jeroboam returned, seized the opportunity, and became king over 10 tribes, forming the Kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam was left with only Judah and Benjamin, forming the Kingdom of Judah centered in Jerusalem. The division was not merely political but deeply symbolic, representing a fracture in covenant unity. The once united people of Israel, bound together under David and Solomon, were now two nations, often rivals, sometimes allies, but rarely reconciled. Jeroboam's first challenge was religious legitimacy. The temple and ark were in Jerusalem under the control of Judah. If the northern tribes continued to travel there for worship, their loyalty might shift back toward the house of David. To prevent this, Jeroboam established alternative sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan, placing golden calves there as representations of divine presence. He declared, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt," echoing the language of Aaron's golden calf centuries earlier. This act was not necessarily intended as outright rejection of the God of Israel, but as a political strategy to provide alternative centres of worship. yet the biblical tradition consistently condemns it as idolatry, marking it as the sin of Jeroboam that set Israel on a path of religious compromise. The northern kingdom, Israel, with its capital eventually established at Samaria, was larger and more populous, with fertile land and greater access to trade routes. It often enjoyed economic advantages, yet its political instability undermined its strength. Dynasties rose and fell quickly, with frequent coups and assassinations. The southern kingdom, Judah, though smaller and less prosperous, retained the stability of the Davidic dynasty, ruling continuously from Jerusalem. This continuity, coupled with the presence of the temple, gave Judah a stronger sense of religious legitimacy, even as it too struggled with idolatry and disobedience. The division created vulnerability. Instead of one united kingdom capable of resisting external pressures, there were now two weaker states, often in conflict with one another. At times they allied, particularly against common enemies like the Arameans or Moabites, but more often they engaged in rivalry, weakening themselves in the face of larger empires. Egypt, Aram, Assyria, and eventually Babylon all took advantage of this division, manipulating alliances and exerting influence over the fractured kingdoms. Religiously, the division intensified the struggle between covenant fidelity and assimilation. In Israel, Jeroboam's golden calves set a precedent for alternative worship that persisted through successive dynasties. Prophets consistently denounced this deviation, linking Israel's eventual downfall to its idolatry. In Judah, despite the presence of the temple, kings alternated between faithfulness and compromise, often tolerating high places and Canaanite cults alongside covenant worship. The prophetic voices that arose during this period, figures like Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, served as critics of both kingdoms, reminding them that their political survival depended not on alliances or armies, but on covenant fidelity. The social consequences of division were significant. Trade routes were disrupted, border conflicts erupted, and loyalties fractured. The unity that had once allowed Israel to dominate the region under David and Solomon dissolved into vulnerability. While Israel often appeared stronger on the surface, with greater wealth and population, its instability made it more susceptible to collapse. Judah, smaller and often weaker militarily, endured longer due to dynastic continuity and the unifying presence of the temple. Yet both kingdoms ultimately failed to heed prophetic warnings, leading to their eventual downfall. The division of the kingdom also reshaped identity. No longer was Israel a single united people. The term increasingly referred to the northern kingdom, while Judah developed its own distinct sense of identity. Over time, Jew, derived from Judah, would become the broader designation for the Hebrew people, particularly after the northern kingdom's destruction. The division thus influenced not only political history, but also the language of identity that endured into later centuries. The biblical writers interpreted the division theologically as a consequence of Solomon's failures. His idolatry and heavy burdens were seen as the cause, with the division framed as divine judgment. Yet even within judgment, hope persisted. The house of David was preserved, and prophetic voices continued to call for repentance and renewal. The division was not the end of the covenant, but a painful stage in its unfolding, revealing the consequences of disobedience and the fragility of human leadership. The division of Israel and Judah illustrates the dangers of disunity, the consequences of burdensome rule, and the enduring tension between political pragmatism and covenant fidelity. What had been achieved under David and Solomon, unity, prosperity, and centralization, proved fragile when leaders failed to balance justice, mercy, and obedience. The fracture of the kingdom shaped Hebrew history for centuries, influencing their political fate, their religious development, and their self-understanding. The story now turns to the prophets and kings who inhabited this divided landscape, figures who confronted idolatry, called for justice, and challenged rulers. Among them, Elijah and Elisha stand out as dramatic voices in the northern kingdom, confronting its kings and exposing the destructive consequences of abandoning covenant fidelity. Their stories illustrate the ongoing struggle to preserve Hebrew identity in a fractured and compromised world. The division of the kingdom left Israel and Judah weakened, vulnerable, and increasingly prone to compromise. In the north, political instability combined with religious deviation created conditions ripe for prophetic intervention. The golden calves of Jeroboam had already set Israel on a trajectory of idolatry, and successive dynasties deepened this pattern. Kings sought legitimacy not by returning to covenant worship, but by accommodating Canaanite practices, particularly the worship of Baal, the storm and fertility god whose cult was widespread throughout the region. The infiltration of Baal worship into Israelite life represented not merely a religious shift, but a profound threat to identity, for it undermined the exclusive covenant with the God of Israel and risked dissolving the distinctiveness that set the people apart. It is within this context that Elijah and Elisha emerged, prophetic figures whose confrontations with kings and cults embodied the struggle for Israel's very soul. Elijah, the Tishbite from Gilead, appeared suddenly in the biblical narrative without genealogical background or introduction, underscoring the prophetic principle that authority derived not from lineage but from divine commission. His first act was to declare a drought, a direct challenge to Baal, who was believed to control rain and fertility. By shutting the heavens through his word, Elijah symbolically undermined the very foundation of Baal worship. His prophetic life during the drought, fed by ravens, sustained by a widow's meagre supplies miraculously multiplied, raising her son from death, demonstrated that the God of Israel, not Baal, provided sustenance, life, and renewal. The confrontation reached its dramatic climax on Mount Carmel, where Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a contest. 2 altars were prepared, one for Baal and one for the God of Israel, with the challenge that fire would fall from heaven on the true sacrifice. The prophets of Baal cried out in vain, cutting themselves in frenzied rituals, but no fire came. Elijah, after dousing his altar with water to eliminate any trickery, prayed simply, and fire fell, consuming the sacrifice, the altar, and even the water in the trench. The people, witnessing the power of the God of Israel, fell prostrate, declaring, "The Lord, He is God." This moment symbolized the theological battle at the heart of Israel's identity. Baal worship might promise prosperity, but only the covenant God commanded the forces of creation. Yet Elijah's triumph was short-lived. Queen Jezebel, the Phoenician wife of King Ahab and a fervent supporter of Baal worship, vowed to kill him. Elijah fled into the wilderness, despondent and despairing, convinced he was the last faithful prophet. His encounter at Mount Horeb, where he experienced God not in wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper, transformed his understanding of divine power. The lesson was that God's presence is not always revealed in dramatic displays, but often in subtle, sustaining ways. This shift in perspective strengthened Elijah to continue his mission, reminding future generations that covenant faithfulness does not depend on spectacle, but on perseverance in the face of opposition. Elijah's confrontations with Ahab also highlighted the prophetic role in matters of justice. The episode of Naboth's vineyard illustrates this dimension. When Ahab desired Naboth's vineyard, Jezebel arranged Naboth's death through false accusations, and Ahab seized the land. Elijah confronted the king, declaring judgment for his injustice. This narrative emphasizes that covenant faithfulness encompasses not only worship, but also social and ethical integrity. Prophets challenged kings not merely for idolatry, but for corruption, oppression, and exploitation, linking worship of God with justice toward neighbor. Elijah's ministry culminated in his dramatic departure, taken up in a whirlwind with chariots of fire. This extraordinary end set him apart in memory as a prophet of enduring significance, expected in later tradition to return as a forerunner of messianic renewal. His legacy embodied uncompromising confrontation with idolatry and injustice, establishing a prophetic model that endured throughout Hebrew history. Elisha, his successor, continued the prophetic mission but with a different character. While Elijah's ministry was marked by confrontation and dramatic displays, Elisha's was remembered for miracles of provision, healing, and restoration. He purified poisoned water, multiplied oil for a widow, restored the health of Naaman the Syrian, and even raised the dead. These acts demonstrated that the God of Israel was not only a God of judgment, but also of compassion and power, active in the everyday lives of people. Elisha's ministry extended beyond Israel's borders, reflecting the universal scope of divine power, while still affirming the exclusivity of covenant loyalty. Elisha also confronted kings, continuing the prophetic role as both counselor and critic. He advised Israel's kings in battles against Aram, providing strategies and assuring victory when faithfulness was shown. His miraculous acts in these contexts underscored that military success depended not on alliances or numbers, but on divine favour. Yet his ministry also revealed the persistent weakness of Israel's rulers, who continued to compromise with idolatry despite prophetic warnings. The northern struggle during the time of Elijah and Elisha was not merely about religious practices, but about national survival and identity. The infiltration of Baal worship threatened to dissolve Israel's distinctiveness, reducing them to just another Canaanite state indistinguishable from their neighbours. The prophets' confrontations highlighted the principle that covenant faithfulness was not optional, but essential for survival. The dramatic signs on Mount Carmel, the miracles of provision, the condemnations of injustice, all pointed to the reality that only loyalty to the God of Israel could sustain the nation. The role of prophets in this period also reveals the unique character of Hebrew religion compared to surrounding cultures. In most ancient Near Eastern states, prophets or diviners served the king, legitimizing his rule and affirming his policies. In Israel, however, prophets often opposed kings, challenging their actions and calling them back to covenant fidelity. This tension established a dynamic that prevented the king from claiming absolute authority. Prophets functioned as voices of divine sovereignty over and above royal power, ensuring that covenant obligations remained central. The struggles of the northern kingdom during this era illustrate the consequences of division and disobedience. Politically, Israel was unstable, with dynasties changing frequently through coups and assassinations. Spiritually, the adoption of Baal worship and other Canaanite practices undermined covenant fidelity. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha emerged not as marginal figures, but as central actors in shaping the nation's destiny, reminding both rulers and people that their survival depended on their relationship with the God of Israel. The northern struggle also foreshadowed the eventual downfall of Israel. Though prophetic interventions brought temporary reforms and moments of renewal, the underlying trajectory remained one of compromise and decline. The northern kingdom, larger and often more prosperous than Judah, lacked the dynastic stability and central sanctuary that anchored Judah in Jerusalem. Its kings, from Jeroboam onward, continued in practices condemned as idolatry, setting the stage for its eventual conquest by Assyria. Yet even amid failure, the prophetic voices preserved hope. Elijah's experience of the divine whisper, Elisha's miracles of healing, and their continued proclamation of covenant faithfulness demonstrated that God's presence endured even in times of decline. Their legacies shaped later prophetic traditions, influencing figures like Amos and Hosea, who would continue to challenge Israel's kings and call for repentance. The memory of their struggle against Baal worship and royal corruption became paradigmatic, illustrating the ongoing battle between covenant faithfulness and cultural assimilation. The period of Elijah and Elisha thus represents one of the most dramatic and formative phases of Hebrew history. It reveals the depth of the northern kingdom's compromises, the courage of prophetic voices in confronting kings and cults, and the centrality of covenant as the defining principle of identity. Their stories, filled with confrontation, miracle, despair, and hope, preserved the lesson that survival and blessing were inseparable from loyalty to the God of Israel. From this northern struggle, the story moves toward larger forces at work in the region. The rise of Assyria, with its expanding empire and relentless campaigns, would soon overshadow both Israel and Judah. The prophetic voices that began with Elijah and Elisha would continue, warning of impending judgment, but also offering glimpses of restoration. The northern kingdom's compromises had set it on a path toward destruction, but even in this trajectory, prophets insisted that covenant faithfulness remained the only hope. The prophetic warnings of Elijah and Elisha about idolatry, injustice, and covenant infidelity unfolded against the backdrop of growing regional upheaval. By the 8th century BCE, the balance of power in the ancient Near East shifted dramatically with the rise of Assyria, an empire whose expansion, military innovation, and ruthless administration reshaped the destiny of nations from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. For Israel, the northern kingdom, the ascendancy of Assyria spelled doom. Its political instability, its compromises in worship, and its reliance on fragile alliances left it unable to withstand the relentless pressure of imperial domination. The fall of Israel, remembered as the exile of the 10 northern tribes, became a turning point in Hebrew history, a sobering demonstration of prophetic warnings fulfilled and covenant disobedience judged. Assyria had long been a significant force, but in the 9th and 8th centuries it experienced resurgence under powerful kings such as Ashur-nasir-pal II, Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, and Sargon II. Their military campaigns extended westward, subjugating Aramean states, Phoenician cities, and eventually Israel itself. Assyrian armies were renowned for their discipline, iron weaponry, siege engines, and brutal tactics. Conquered peoples were subjected to heavy tribute, and rebellious states faced devastating reprisals, including mass deportations designed to break resistance by scattering populations across the empire. Israel, larger and more fertile than Judah, was strategically placed along trade routes linking Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. This position made it both valuable and vulnerable. Its kings alternated between submission to Assyria, paying tribute to avoid destruction, and rebellion, often seeking alliances with Egypt or Aram to resist imperial domination. This oscillation reflected both political pragmatism and desperation, but it consistently failed, for Assyria's power was too great and Egypt's promises too unreliable. The prophets of this era, particularly Amos and Hosea, denounced these political maneuvers as faithless, warning that reliance on foreign powers rather than on the God of Israel would bring disaster. Amos, a shepherd from Judah who prophesied in Israel, condemned not only idolatry but also social injustice, exploitation of the poor, corruption in courts, and ostentatious luxury among the elite. He warned that covenant faithfulness required justice and righteousness, not empty ritual. His declarations that God despised festivals and sacrifices when justice was absent struck at the heart of Israelite complacency. Hosea, prophesying around the same time, used the metaphor of a broken marriage to describe Israel's unfaithfulness, portraying the nation as an unfaithful wife who pursued other lovers, alliances and idols, while abandoning her true husband. Both prophets linked Israel's political and social decline to spiritual infidelity, insisting that the nation's only hope lay in repentance and renewed loyalty to God. Despite these warnings, Israel's political instability deepened. Dynasties rose and fell through assassinations, coups, and external interventions. Jeroboam Thin, who reigned in the mid-8th century, brought a temporary resurgence of prosperity and expansion, but his death was followed by rapid decline. In just a few decades, multiple kings were assassinated, and the throne changed hands repeatedly, leaving the kingdom weak and divided. This instability made Israel ripe for Assyrian intervention. Tiglath-Pileser III, one of Assyria's most formidable rulers, campaigned in the west during the mid-8th century, reducing states to vassalage and deporting rebellious populations. Israel, under King Pekah, attempted resistance by forming alliances with Aram Damascus and pressuring Judah to join. This conflict, known as the Syro-Ephraimite War, brought Assyria into direct confrontation with Israel. Judah, under King Ahaz, appealed to Assyria for help, submitting as a vassal in exchange for protection. Tiglath-Pileser responded with brutal efficiency, defeating Aram, annexing much of Israel's territory, and deporting large portions of its population. The kingdom of Israel was reduced to a shadow of its former self, with only a small core remaining. The final collapse came under Hoshea, the last king of Israel. Initially installed as a vassal by Assyria, Hoshea later rebelled by seeking support from Egypt. Shalmaneser V responded by besieging Samaria, Israel's capital. The siege lasted 3 years, a testament to the city's fortifications and the desperation of its inhabitants. In 722 BCE, the city fell, either to Shalmaneser Femv or to his successor, Sargondaend, who claimed credit for the conquest. The fall of Samaria marked the end of the northern kingdom. Its people were deported to various regions of the Assyrian Empire, while foreign populations were resettled in the land, creating a mixed community that would later be associated with the Samaritans. The exile of the northern tribes became one of the defining traumas of Hebrew memory. Known as the Lost Tribes of Israel, their fate remains uncertain. Some were assimilated into Assyrian society, others scattered across regions from Mesopotamia to Media. The biblical tradition interprets their disappearance as judgment for persistent idolatry, particularly the sins of Jeroboam and the worship of Baal. The prophets had warned that disobedience would lead to exile, and now their words were fulfilled. The land, once promised as an inheritance, was lost, and the people were dispersed, their identity fractured. The fall of Israel also had profound implications for Judah, the southern kingdom. Judah survived the Assyrian onslaught by submitting as a vassal, paying tribute, and at times narrowly escaping destruction. Prophets in Judah, such as Isaiah and Micah, interpreted Israel's fall as both a warning and a lesson. If Judah persisted in similar sins, idolatry, injustice, reliance on foreign alliances, it too would face judgment. The preservation of Jerusalem during Assyria's campaigns was seen not as proof of invulnerability, but as evidence of divine patience, granting Judah time to repent. Assyrian domination left its mark not only politically but culturally. The resettlement of foreigners in Israel introduced new religious practices, creating a syncretism that persisted into later centuries. The emergence of the Samaritan community, with its distinct worship at Mount Gerizim, traces back to this Assyrian policy of mixing populations. For Judah, the memory of Israel's fall reinforced the centrality of covenant fidelity, intensifying debates over idolatry, justice, and the role of the temple. From a broader perspective, the fall of Israel illustrates the realities of ancient Near Eastern geopolitics. Small states situated between empires like Assyria and Egypt often found themselves caught in the crossfire, their survival dependent on submission or precarious alliances. Israel's position along trade routes made it valuable, but its instability and compromises made it vulnerable. Assyria's policy of deportation ensured that resistance would be punished not merely by conquest, but by the erasure of national identity. The lost tribes became a lasting symbol of the consequences of disobedience and the fragility of identity when covenant faithfulness is abandoned. Yet even in exile, hope persisted. Hosea's message included promises of restoration, that God would one day call his people back and renew the covenant. The scattering, though judgment, was not the final word. The theological interpretation of Israel's fall emphasized both justice and mercy, judgment for idolatry and injustice, but hope for eventual restoration. This dual theme would shape later prophetic writings, influencing how exiles from Judah interpreted their own fate under Babylon. The Assyrian domination and fall of Israel thus represent both a historical reality and a theological turning point. Historically, it was the end of the northern kingdom, the scattering of its people, and the absorption of its territory into the Assyrian Empire. Theologically, it was the fulfillment of prophetic warnings, a demonstration that covenant infidelity leads to exile, and a reminder that survival depends on loyalty to the God of Israel. The memory of the lost tribes haunted later generations, serving as both warning and mystery, while the survival of Judah ensured that the covenant story would continue, now shaped by the lessons of Israel's downfall. The focus of Hebrew history now shifts to Judah, the southern kingdom, which endured longer but faced its own struggles under Assyrian domination. Prophets like Isaiah and Micah emerged in this context, calling for justice, warning of judgment, and envisioning a future of restoration. The fall of Israel was not the end of the Hebrew story, but a sobering prelude to the trials that Judah would soon face under the same imperial pressures. The destruction of Israel by Assyria in 722 BCE left Judah as the sole surviving Hebrew kingdom. Though smaller, poorer, and often politically overshadowed by its neighbours, Judah endured for over a century after Israel's fall, clinging to its capital in Jerusalem and the enduring memory of David's dynasty. Yet Judah's survival was precarious. Assyrian dominance still loomed large, and the lesson of Israel's fate was both sobering and ambiguous. Some in Judah interpreted their survival as proof of divine favour tied to the temple and the Davidic covenant. Others, especially the prophets, warned that Judah was guilty of the same sins as Israel: idolatry, injustice, and misplaced trust in foreign alliances, and that judgment would come if the people did not repent. The stage was set for Babylon's rise, a new imperial power that would eclipse Assyria, conquer Jerusalem, and inaugurate the exile, one of the most transformative experiences in Hebrew history. After Israel's fall, Judah initially survived as an Assyrian vassal. Kings like Hezekiah attempted reforms, purging idolatry and centralizing worship in Jerusalem, while also testing Assyrian patience by resisting tribute. The Assyrian king Sennacherib famously besieged Jerusalem in 701 BCE after Hezekiah rebelled. According to Assyrian records, he devastated much of Judah and trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, though he did not capture Jerusalem itself. The biblical account attributes Jerusalem's survival to divine intervention, with Sennacherib's army struck down by a plague. This narrow escape reinforced the belief in some quarters that Jerusalem was inviolable, protected by the presence of the temple and the Davidic promise. Yet prophets like Isaiah insisted that survival was due not to invulnerability, but to God's mercy, and that Judah must pursue justice, righteousness, and covenant faithfulness to endure. The decline of Assyria in the late 7th century altered the balance of power once more. Internal strife, external attacks, and the rise of new powers weakened Assyria. The Babylonians, allied at first with the Medes, rose as the new imperial force, defeating Assyria and eventually destroying its capital, Nineveh, in 612 BCE. The fall of Assyria, which had dominated the region for centuries, was monumental, reshaping the political map of the Near East. Egypt, seeking to fill the vacuum and protect its interests, intervened, leading to clashes with Babylon, as both powers vied for dominance over the Levant. Judah, caught between these empires, found itself in a precarious position. King Josiah, one of Judah's most significant rulers, initiated sweeping reforms in the late 7th century, rediscovering the law, possibly Deuteronomy, and centralizing worship in Jerusalem. He sought to purge idolatry, destroy high places, and renew covenant faithfulness. For a time, his reforms revitalized religious life and gave hope that Judah might avoid Israel's fate. Yet Josiah's reign ended tragically when he confronted Pharaoh Necho-Su at Megiddo in 609 BCE and was killed. His death shocked the nation, leaving Judah weakened and politically unstable. In the aftermath, Judah became a pawn in the struggle between Egypt and Babylon. Jehoahaz, Josiah's son, reigned briefly before being deposed by Pharaoh Necho, who installed his brother Jehoiakim as king. Jehoiakim served Egypt initially, but after Babylon's decisive victory over Egypt at Carchemish in 605 BCE, under Nebuchadnezzar II, Judah became a Babylonian vassal. Jehoiakim's shifting loyalties, rebelling against Babylon while hoping for Egyptian support, provoked Babylonian reprisals. Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful rulers in Babylonian history, asserted his dominance over Judah through a series of invasions. In 597 BCE, after Jehoiakim's rebellion, Jerusalem was besieged. Jehoiakim died during the siege, and his son Jehoiachin surrendered. The Babylonians deported the young king, members of the royal family, skilled artisans and soldiers to Babylon, beginning the first wave of exile. This deportation removed much of the leadership and weakened Judah, though the city and temple remained intact. Nebuchadnezzar placed Zedekiah, Jehoiachin's uncle, on the throne as a puppet king. Zedekiah, however, wavered in his loyalty, influenced by nationalist sentiment and the hope of Egyptian support. Prophets like Jeremiah warned against rebellion, insisting that submission to Babylon was the only path to survival. Jeremiah argued that Babylon was the instrument of divine judgment, and resistance would only bring destruction. His message, unpopular and branded as treasonous by many, highlighted the tension between prophetic warnings and royal policies. Despite these warnings, Zedekiah rebelled, provoking Babylon's decisive response. In 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returned, laying siege to Jerusalem. After months of famine and desperation, the city fell. The walls were breached, the temple was destroyed, and the city was burned. Zedekiah attempted to flee but was captured. His sons were executed before him, and then his eyes were put out before he was taken to Babylon. The destruction of the temple, the symbol of God's presence and covenant, was catastrophic. For the people of Judah, this was not merely a military defeat, but a theological crisis. The city that was supposed to be inviolable, the temple where God's name dwelt, and the dynasty of David, all were brought low. The exile of Judah followed, with further deportations of the population to Babylon. Though not all were taken, many peasants remained in the land under Babylonian administration. The leadership, priests, scribes, and much of the elite were carried into exile. This scattering created a diaspora, with communities now established in Babylon as well as in Egypt, where some fled after the assassination of Gedaliah, the Babylonian-appointed governor. Judah was no longer an independent kingdom, but a province under Babylonian control, its identity shattered and its future uncertain. The exile represented one of the most profound turning points in Hebrew history. Politically, it ended the Davidic monarchy and the independent state of Judah. Religiously, it shattered assumptions about the temple and land as inviolable guarantees of divine favour. Theologically, it forced a re-examination of covenant identity. If the temple could be destroyed and the people exiled, what did it mean to be God's people? Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel interpreted the exile as divine judgment for centuries of idolatry, injustice, and disobedience. Yet they also proclaimed hope, envisioning restoration, a new covenant, and even a return to the land. In Babylon, the exiles faced the challenge of maintaining identity in a foreign land. The Babylonians, unlike the Assyrians, did not erase populations through assimilation, but allowed deportees to live in communities, maintain customs, and even prosper economically. The exiles settled along the Chebar Canal and other areas, where they built lives, engaged in trade, and maintained traditions. The Psalms of exile capture their grief. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion. Yet even in grief, seeds of renewal were sown. The exile became the crucible in which Hebrew identity was reshaped, emphasizing law, scripture, and community rather than land and temple alone. Ezekiel, prophesying among the exiles, envisioned God's glory departing from the temple in Jerusalem and appearing in Babylon, demonstrating that God was not confined to a building or location. His visions of a restored temple and a reconstituted people offered hope that exile was not the end. Jeremiah's letter to the exiles encouraged them to seek the welfare of Babylon, to build houses and plant gardens, for their future restoration was assured but not immediate. These prophetic voices redefined covenant identity for a dispersed people, laying foundations for later Judaism. The Babylonian exile also stimulated literary and theological developments. The collection, editing, and preservation of traditions became urgent, ensuring that identity could be maintained in the absence of land and temple. Genealogies, laws, and narratives were compiled, embedding memory into written form. The trauma of exile deepened reflection on divine justice and sovereignty, prompting questions about suffering, judgment, and hope. The experience of displacement and survival forged resilience, teaching that identity could endure beyond political independence. Meanwhile, Babylon itself stood as a symbol of human power and arrogance. Nebuchadnezzar's grand building projects, including the fabled Hanging Gardens and the reconstruction of the city's walls and temples, displayed imperial magnificence. For the exiles, Babylon was both their captor and the stage on which they redefined faith. Its grandeur contrasted with their grief, but its stability provided space for survival and adaptation. The rise of Babylon and the exile of Judah thus represent both destruction and transformation. The end of the monarchy, the destruction of the temple, and the scattering of the people were devastating. Yet out of this crisis emerged a redefined identity, one no longer tied exclusively to land, temple, or king, but to covenant, law, and community. The exile became not only a period of loss, but also the seedbed of renewal, preparing the way for return under Persia, and shaping the trajectory of Hebrew faith for centuries. The focus now shifts from Babylonian power to Persian ascendancy, as Cyrus the Great would soon conquer Babylon and allow exiles to return. But before that moment of restoration, the exile itself stood as both wound and teacher, reminding the Hebrews that faithfulness was the only true ground of security, and that even in foreign lands their God remained with them. The destruction of Jerusalem and the deportations to Babylon in 586 BCE created an existential crisis for the people of Judah. For generations, identity had been tied to land, temple, and dynasty. The land was the covenant inheritance, the temple the visible sign of God's dwelling, and the Davidic dynasty the guarantee of continuity. With all three apparently lost, the land occupied by foreigners, the temple destroyed, and the monarchy ended, the people faced a fundamental question. What did it mean to be the people of God in exile? The decades in Babylon forced the Hebrews to reconstruct identity apart from the institutions that had previously defined them. Far from erasing them, exile became the crucible in which Jewish identity was reshaped around law, scripture, and community, preparing the way for survival through future dispersions. Life in Babylon, while initially marked by trauma, gradually stabilized. The deportations had targeted the elite, kings, priests, artisans, and soldiers. They were settled not as enslaved individuals dispersed into households, but as communities placed in designated areas such as the Chiba Canal region. Babylonian policy differed from the Assyrian approach. Instead of scattering populations to erase their identity, Babylonians allowed exiles to live together, maintain cohesion, and even thrive economically, so long as they remained loyal subjects. This policy had a paradoxical effect. It stripped Judah of independence but preserved the people's communal structures, allowing them to adapt and endure. The Psalms of exile capture the grief of displacement. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows, there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs. These laments reflect the pain of losing Jerusalem, but they also reveal the beginning of cultural preservation through memory. The refusal to sing Zion's songs for Babylonian entertainment showed that identity would not dissolve into captivity. Instead, grief turned into determination to remember, to teach, and to maintain covenant traditions even far from the temple. Economically, the exiles adapted. Babylon was a prosperous empire, and deportees were often settled in fertile regions where they could farm, trade, and contribute to local economies. Clay tablets discovered in Babylonian archives record Jewish names engaged in business transactions, indicating that many prospered materially over time. While some remained poor and marginalized, others gained influence, forming communities with elders and leaders who preserved social cohesion. This adaptability meant that exile was not simply a story of oppression, but also one of cultural resilience. Religiously, the absence of the temple forced a profound reorientation. Sacrificial worship, the centre of Jerusalem's temple ritual, was no longer possible. Instead, prayer, fasting, and study became increasingly central. Synagogue-like gatherings, though not yet fully institutionalized, likely began as settings for communal prayer, scripture reading, and teaching. These practices ensured that worship could continue without the temple, and that covenant traditions could be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The emphasis shifted from place to practice, from temple rituals to Torah-centered life. The role of law grew in significance. The Torah, which had already been central, now became the primary anchor of identity. Deuteronomy, with its emphasis on obedience, covenant, and remembrance, took on new resonance. If the land and temple could be lost, the law could not. It could be carried, taught, and lived anywhere. The prophets reinforced this shift. Jeremiah urged the exiles to seek the welfare of Babylon, to build houses, plant gardens, and live faithfully, while promising eventual return. Ezekiel, among the exiles, envisioned the presence of God not confined to Jerusalem but with his people in Babylon, reminding them that divine faithfulness was not tied to geography. His visions of restoration, new covenant, and new temple provided hope that exile was not the end but a stage in the ongoing covenant story. The crisis of exile also intensified the role of scripture. Traditions that had previously been transmitted orally or through scattered records were now compiled, edited, and preserved with new urgency. The Deuteronomistic history, recounting the story from Joshua through Kings, interpreted the fall of Israel and Judah as the result of covenant disobedience, embedding a theology of history that explained catastrophe while preserving hope for restoration. Genealogies were carefully maintained, ensuring continuity of identity despite displacement. The act of writing became an act of survival, turning memory into text and embedding covenant identity into literature that could outlast exile. Prophetic voices deepened reflection on the meaning of exile. Jeremiah interpreted it as 70 years of discipline, after which restoration would come. Ezekiel envisioned dry bones brought to life, symbolizing the revival of a dead nation. Isaiah's later chapters, often called Second Isaiah, proclaimed comfort, hope, and the promise of return under a new deliverer. These messages prevented despair from overwhelming the exiles, offering theological frameworks to interpret suffering not as abandonment, but as chastisement and preparation. The exile also reshaped attitudes toward idolatry. Having seen their temple destroyed and their land lost, many exiles became more resolute in rejecting foreign gods. The humiliation of defeat could have led to assimilation, but instead it often led to renewed devotion to exclusivity. Later Jewish tradition remembered the exile as the turning point when idolatry was decisively rejected and strict monotheism became deeply entrenched. The memory of exile served as a warning never to compromise covenant loyalty again, even when surrounded by foreign cultures. Culturally, the exile exposed the Hebrews to Babylonian society, with its grandeur, literature, and religion. Babylon was a centre of learning, with traditions of astronomy, mathematics, and law. The Hebrews, while resisting assimilation, absorbed some of this cultural environment, which influenced their own thought. Apocalyptic imagery, visions of cosmic struggle and symbolic dreams reflect Babylonian influence filtered through Hebrew theology. At the same time, the exiles' resistance to assimilation shaped their identity more strongly than adoption did. By maintaining distinct customs, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and circumcision, they preserved their separateness. Generational shifts also marked the exile. The first deportees who had known Jerusalem remembered its temple and longed for return. Their grief preserved memory and identity. Later generations born in Babylon knew only exile, and for them, identity had to be taught and transmitted through tradition rather than personal memory. This teaching required deliberate community structures, elders instructing youth, and scripture becoming central. The survival of identity across generations in a foreign land was one of the greatest achievements of the exiles. The exile also created new theological questions. How could the chosen people be conquered? How could the God of Israel be greater than other gods if his temple was destroyed? Prophets and scribes answered by affirming divine sovereignty over all nations. Babylon was not stronger than God. It was his instrument of judgment. The destruction of the temple did not mean God was weak, but that he had chosen to discipline his people for their disobedience. This interpretation preserved faith, transforming apparent defeat into theological meaning. The development of Jewish identity in Babylon laid the groundwork for the future. Even after the Persian conquest and the return under Cyrus, large numbers of Jews remained in Babylon, forming one of the most significant Jewish communities outside the land for centuries. This diaspora community preserved traditions, contributed to literature, and later became central in the development of Rabbinic Judaism. The experience of living faithfully in foreign lands became a permanent feature of Jewish history, shaping how identity was maintained in dispersion. The exile also redefined the concept of covenant. No longer could it be tied exclusively to land, temple, or monarchy. Covenant now meant obedience to Torah, faithfulness in daily life, and hope for future restoration. Community structures, prayer, scripture, and teaching became the pillars of identity, ensuring survival without sovereignty. This shift was not abandonment of the past, but adaptation, enabling continuity through catastrophe. The Babylonian exile, though devastating, was transformative. It preserved the people through reorientation, deepened their devotion to covenant, and created structures that would endure through future trials. The lament of exile became the seed of resilience. The destruction of the temple became the catalyst for Torah-centered faith, and displacement became the foundation of a diaspora identity that would sustain the Jewish people for millennia. The story now turns toward restoration, as Babylon's dominance would eventually give way to Persia. Cyrus the Great would rise, conquer Babylon, and issue decrees that allowed exiles to return. Yet even as some returned to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, others remained in Babylon, shaping Jewish identity in dispersion. Exile had changed everything. It ended one phase of Hebrew history and began another, in which identity was not erased but reborn in new forms. The fall of Babylon to the Persians in 539 BCE marked the end of one imperial chapter and the beginning of another. For the Hebrews exiled in Babylon, this shift in power carried extraordinary significance, for it opened the possibility of return to their land and the rebuilding of the temple that had been destroyed decades earlier. The Persian period became a time of restoration, yet not without struggle. The return from exile was neither immediate nor total, and the community that emerged in Judah, now often called Yehud, a small province within the vast Persian Empire, had to redefine its identity once more, balancing memory of the past with the challenges of rebuilding in a changed world. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, adopted policies distinct from those of Assyria and Babylon. Instead of mass deportations and forced assimilation, he pursued strategies of tolerance and local autonomy, provided that subjects remained loyal and paid tribute. His famous decree, preserved in various forms, allowed exiled peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Cyrus Cylinder, though written in general terms about other peoples, reflects this policy of restoration. The biblical tradition interprets Cyrus's actions as divinely ordained, portraying him as the instrument through whom God fulfilled promises of return. Isaiah even refers to Cyrus as God's anointed, underscoring the theological significance of his role in Hebrew history. The first returnees under Sheshbazzar and later Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, faced daunting challenges. Jerusalem lay in ruins, its walls broken, its temple destroyed, and its population diminished. The land had been occupied by those who had remained during the exile, as well as by neighbouring peoples who had moved into vacated areas. Rebuilding meant not only physical construction, but also negotiation of social, political, and religious tensions. The initial priority was the altar, re-established to resume sacrifices even before the temple was rebuilt. This act symbolised the restoration of worship as the central identity marker, re-establishing covenant life in the land. The rebuilding of the temple, later called the Second Temple, was fraught with difficulty. Work began but stalled due to opposition from neighbouring groups and internal discouragement. Prophets Haggai and Zechariah urged the people to resume, reminding them that divine presence did not depend on grandeur but on faithfulness. Haggai's message emphasized that the glory of the Second Temple would not come from its physical magnificence, but from God's presence among his people. Zechariah's visions link the rebuilding with eschatological hope, envisioning the purification of the priesthood and the ultimate triumph of divine purposes. Encouraged by these prophetic voices, the people completed the temple in 516 BCE, 70 years after its destruction, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years of exile. The Second Temple lacked the Ark of the Covenant and the grandeur of Solomon's temple, yet its significance was profound. It re-established Jerusalem as the centre of worship, provided a focal point for festivals and sacrifices, and symbolised the renewal of covenant life. For a people who had endured exile, its completion was a powerful sign that God's promises had not failed. The rebuilt temple became the anchor of Jewish identity through the Persian and Hellenistic periods, shaping worship until its destruction centuries later by Rome. The Persian period also reshaped political and social structures. Judah was now a province, Yehud, governed by Persian officials but granted a degree of local autonomy under governors, priests, and elders. The Davidic monarchy was not restored in political terms, though the memory of David's line remained. Zerubbabel, as a descendant of David, briefly embodied hope of restored kingship, but his role faded, and the high priesthood emerged as the primary leadership structure. This shift from monarchy to priesthood marked a decisive transformation. Spiritual leadership, centered on the temple and law, became the organizing principle of Jewish life. Ezra and Nehemiah, leaders who came later in the Persian period, further shaped this restoration. Ezra, a scribe and priest, emphasized the centrality of the Torah, teaching it publicly and instituting reforms to preserve covenant fidelity. His insistence on separating from foreign marriages reflected the desire to preserve distinct identity in a context of cultural mixing. Nehemiah, serving as governor, rebuilt Jerusalem's walls, providing physical security and re-establishing the city as a functioning centre. Together, Ezra and Nehemiah embodied the dual focus of the restored community: fidelity to Torah and rebuilding of communal life. Their reforms often provoked resistance, but they established enduring patterns of Jewish identity rooted in law, worship, and separation from surrounding influences. The Persian period also witnessed the crystallization of Scripture as the defining element of identity. The Torah became the authoritative core, read publicly, and interpreted as the constitution of the community. The act of reading and interpreting the law in assemblies marked the transition of identity from political sovereignty to scriptural fidelity. prophets, psalms, and wisdom writings continued to circulate, but the Torah's role as central and binding distinguished Jewish life in Yehud and among the diaspora. Relations with surrounding peoples were complex. Samaritans, descendants of populations resettled in the north during the Assyrian period, and those who had not been exiled, claimed continuity with Israelite traditions. Their opposition to the rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple and their establishment of worship at Mount Gerizim created lasting tensions between Jews and Samaritans. Edomites, Ammonites, and others also competed for land and influence. The restored Jewish community, though small, asserted distinct identity through exclusive worship of the God of Israel, observance of the Torah, and loyalty to the temple in Jerusalem. Life in Yehud under Persian rule was modest compared to the splendour of the united monarchy. The province was small, its population limited, its resources constrained. Yet within these limitations, Jewish identity was consolidated in ways that would endure long after political sovereignty was lost. The emphasis on Torah, temple, and community discipline created a portable identity, capable of surviving under imperial domination and in diaspora contexts. This identity, forged in exile and refined in the Persian period, provided the foundation for later Judaism. Theologically, the return and rebuilding demonstrated both judgment and mercy. Exile had fulfilled the warnings of the prophets, showing that covenant disobedience brought devastation, but return showed that God's promises endured, that covenant was not annulled, and that restoration was possible. The smallness of Yehud compared to the united kingdom of David and Solomon underscored humility, yet the prophets reminded the people that God's purposes were not measured by size or power. Zechariah's vision of a man with a measuring line, hearing the words that Jerusalem would be inhabited without walls because of its future multitude, captured the sense that restoration pointed beyond immediate reality toward eschatological hope. The Persian period thus stands as a bridge between the devastation of exile and the challenges of later domination under Greece and Rome. It was a time of modest political importance but immense religious development. The temple was rebuilt, the Torah was enthroned as the constitution of the community, and identity was redefined around practices that could endure displacement. While the glory of the monarchy was gone, the faith of the people endured, reshaped for survival and continuity. The story now moves toward the Hellenistic era, when Alexander the Great and his successors would dominate the Near East, introducing new cultural pressures and provoking new struggles for identity. Yet the foundation laid in the Persian period, the temple, the Torah, and the community's resilience, ensured that the Jewish people would continue to endure and adapt, carrying forward their covenant story into ever-changing historical contexts. When the Persians dominated the Near East, Judah was a small, quiet province whose life revolved around the rebuilt temple, the Torah, and the rhythms of worship. That relative stability changed suddenly in the late 4th century BCE, when Alexander the Great swept across the region, toppling the Persian Empire and inaugurating an era of Greek cultural and political dominance that historians call the Hellenistic Age. For the Jewish people, Hellenistic rule brought both opportunities and existential threats. The spread of Greek language, institutions, and philosophy challenged Jewish traditions, sparking debates over assimilation and faithfulness. Out of these pressures came one of the most dramatic episodes in Jewish history, the Maccabean Revolt, a grassroots rebellion against oppressive decrees that not only restored the temple, but also gave birth to the Hasmonean kingdom, the only period of Jewish independence between the Babylonian exile and the rise of modern Israel millennia later. Alexander's conquests transformed the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. His armies, drawn from Macedonia and Greece, swept through Asia Minor, Syria, and Palestine, defeating Darius III of Persia and extending Greek influence as far as Egypt and India. When Alexander entered Jerusalem around 332 BCE, according to later traditions, he was greeted with respect by Jewish leaders, and his arrival did not initially disrupt temple life. Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE, however, left his empire divided among his generals, the Diadochi. Two of their successor states, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, vied for control over Palestine, and Judah found itself caught between them. Under the Ptolemies, who controlled Palestine for much of the 3rd century BCE, the Jews experienced relative stability. The Ptolemies encouraged trade and culture, and the Jewish community in Alexandria flourished, producing the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that allowed diaspora Jews to preserve their traditions in a Hellenistic environment. Yet even in this period of calm, Greek culture seeped into Jewish life. Gymnasia, theatres and philosophical schools appeared in surrounding regions, introducing Greek language, dress and customs. For some Jews, especially elites with political or economic ties to Hellenistic rulers, assimilation was attractive. For others, Greek influence threatened covenantal distinctiveness, raising fears of erosion of identity. The situation changed dramatically in the 2nd century BCE when the Seleucids wrested control of Palestine from the Ptolemies. At first their rule was manageable, but under Antiochus IV of Epiphanes, tensions erupted. Antiochus, eager to unify his diverse empire through Hellenization, imposed policies that directly targeted Jewish religious life. He forbade circumcision, Sabbath observance, and sacrifices according to the law. He desecrated the Jerusalem temple, erecting an altar to Zeus and sacrificing pigs within its precincts. For the faithful, this was an abomination, a direct assault on covenantal identity. The crisis demanded response, and it came not from the elite, but from grassroots resistance. The spark of revolt began in the small town of Modane, where a priest named Mattathias refused to offer sacrifice to Greek gods and killed both the king's official and a Jew willing to comply. With his sons, he fled to the hills, rallying others who refused to abandon their traditions. Among his sons, Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, the Hammer, emerged as the leader. Guerrilla warfare against Seleucid forces ensued, with the Maccabees exploiting terrain, surprise and religious zeal to overcome larger, better-equipped armies. Their victories, though improbable, were attributed to divine favour, reinforcing the conviction that fidelity to Torah brought deliverance even against overwhelming odds. In 164 BCE, Judas and his followers recaptured Jerusalem, cleansed the temple, and rededicated it to the God of Israel. The festival of Hanukkah, meaning dedication, commemorates this event, celebrating the miracle of restored worship after desecration. Though the traditional story of oil lasting 8 days appears in later rabbinic tradition, the core of Hanukkah lies in the triumph of fidelity over assimilation, resistance over oppression, and the renewal of covenantal worship in the temple. The Maccabean revolt thus became a symbol of Jewish resilience, inspiring later generations facing threats to their identity. The struggle did not end with the rededication of the temple. The Seleucids continued efforts to subdue the rebels, and successive Maccabean leaders extended the conflict, gradually securing greater autonomy. Simon, one of the surviving sons of Mattathias, achieved recognition as high priest and ruler, establishing what became known as the Hasmonean dynasty. For the first time since the Babylonian exile, Jews enjoyed political independence, ruling their own territory, controlling Jerusalem and expanding their borders. The Hasmonean kingdom, though not as expansive as David's or Solomon's, represented a remarkable achievement in a world dominated by empires. The Hasmonean rulers combined religious and political authority, serving as both high priests and kings. This dual role was controversial, as traditionalists questioned the legitimacy of combining priestly and royal functions outside the Davidic line. Yet the dynasty endured for about a century, from roughly 140 to 63 BCE, during which time it expanded territory to include Idumea, Galilee and parts of Samaria. Forced conversions of conquered populations, including the Idumeans, reflected both zeal for covenantal purity and the realities of territorial control. The Hasmonean period was marked by both achievement and tension. On one hand, independence, expansion, and restored temple worship were sources of pride. On the other hand, internal divisions and increasing entanglement in Hellenistic politics undermined stability. Within Judaism, factions emerged. The Sadducees, often associated with priestly elites and accommodation to Hellenistic influences. The Pharisees, emphasizing strict adherence to Torah and traditions of interpretation. And the Essenes, who withdrew from society, seeking purity in isolated communities. These divisions reflected different responses to the challenges of Hellenistic culture and Hasmonean rule. The Hasmonean rulers themselves increasingly adopted Hellenistic practices, building palaces, minting coins, and engaging in diplomacy with surrounding states. What had begun as a revolt against Hellenization gradually incorporated elements of Greek culture, creating tension between ideals of covenantal purity and the realities of political power. This irony did not escape later Jewish critics, who viewed the dynasty as compromised despite its achievements. Externally, the Hasmonean kingdom navigated the complex politics of the Hellenistic world, caught between the fading Seleucid dynasty and the rising power of Rome. Initially, alliances with Rome provided security, but internal disputes invited Roman intervention. Civil wars between rival Hasmonean claimants weakened the kingdom, and in 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem, effectively ending Jewish independence. Though the temple continued to function, and Hasmonean rulers remained in reduced roles, real sovereignty passed into Roman hands. The Maccabean revolt and Hasmonean kingdom left an enduring legacy. The revolt demonstrated that Jewish identity could withstand the most intense cultural and political pressures, preserving covenantal distinctiveness against enforced assimilation. Hanukkah became the annual reminder of this resilience, celebrating not military might alone but the restoration of worship and fidelity. The Hasmonean kingdom, though flawed, represented a rare moment of self-rule, shaping Jewish political imagination for centuries. Its struggles with Hellenistic influence, internal factions, and external empires foreshadowed the challenges of later periods under Rome. Theologically, the period reinforced the conviction that covenant faithfulness was non-negotiable. Attempts to erase circumcision, Sabbath, and Torah observance had provoked revolt, not assimilation. The success of the Maccabees was remembered as divine vindication of fidelity, encouraging future generations to endure persecution with hope of deliverance. At the same time, the compromises of the Hasmoneans reminded later Jews that independence without righteousness was hollow, that true identity depended not on political power, but on covenant obedience. The Hellenistic era also deepened Jewish engagement with broader intellectual currents. Greek language became widespread, facilitating the spread of Jewish ideas in the diaspora. The Septuagint shaped how Jews outside Palestine read their scriptures, influencing even early Christian communities centuries later. Debates over assimilation and distinctiveness sharpened, forcing Jews to articulate what practices were essential to identity. These debates produced diversity, Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, but also vitality, ensuring that Jewish tradition remained dynamic in the face of cultural challenge. The Hasmonean period, therefore, was both a triumph and a caution. It preserved Jewish identity in the face of enforced Hellenization, restored the temple, and achieved independence. Yet it also revealed the dangers of internal division, compromise, and entanglement in imperial politics. Its legacy endured in memory, liturgy, and sectarian debates, shaping the world into which Rome would enter and into which Jesus of Nazareth would later be born. The story now moves to the Roman era, when Herod the Great and his successors would rule Judea as client kings, balancing local traditions with imperial demands. The independence gained under the Hasmoneans would not return, but the memory of the Maccabees remained, inspiring hope that God could raise deliverers in times of oppression. The Hasmonean dynasty, born out of resistance to Hellenistic oppression, had provided the Jewish people with a rare century of political independence. Yet as their rule extended, it became increasingly entangled with the very cultural and political forces it had once resisted. Internal rivalries fractured the dynasty, Hellenistic practices infiltrated its courts, and competing factions sought external allies to secure power. These divisions weakened Jewish autonomy, and in 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem. His arrival marked the end of Hasmonean independence and the beginning of Roman domination, a new imperial order that would define the world in which Jesus was born. Pompey's intervention was invited by rival Hasmonean claimants, Hyrcanus III and Aristobulus II, whose civil war opened the door to foreign involvement. When Pompey entered Jerusalem after a siege, he famously stepped into the temple's Holy of Holies, an act that shocked and outraged the Jews. Though he refrained from looting the temple, the desecration symbolized Roman disregard for Jewish sacred traditions. From that point onward, Judea was no longer fully independent. It became a client state of Rome, paying tribute and subject to imperial oversight. The Hasmoneans continued to rule in diminished capacity, but real sovereignty belonged to Rome. Rome's involvement in Judea deepened over the following decades, as internal strife and external ambitions reshaped the region. Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian, later Augustus, all played roles in determining Judea's leadership, using it as a pawn in broader imperial struggles. Amid these shifting allegiances rose the figure of Herod, known later as Herod the Great, who would dominate Judea for decades and leave a legacy that defined the political landscape of Jesus' time. Herod was of Idumean descent, from a people forced into Jewish identity during the Hasmonean expansion. This background made him suspect in the eyes of many Jews who saw him as an outsider. Yet through political cunning and Roman support, Herod secured kingship. Declared king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 BCE, he consolidated power after several years of conflict, establishing a reign that lasted until 4 BCE. Herod's rule illustrates the complexities of client kingship. He was a servant of Rome, maintaining loyalty to Augustus, yet he sought legitimacy among his Jewish subjects through grand building projects and careful political maneuvering. Herod's reign was marked by both extraordinary achievements and notorious brutality. On one hand, he launched massive construction projects, transforming the landscape of Judea. Most famously, he rebuilt and expanded the Jerusalem Temple, creating one of the most magnificent sanctuaries of the ancient world. The temple complex he developed, with its vast courts and gleaming white stone, became a source of pride and identity for Jews across the diaspora, symbolizing both divine presence and national resilience. Even though Herod himself was distrusted, the temple he built stood as a focal point of Jewish life, attracting pilgrims and reinforcing Jerusalem's centrality. Beyond the temple, Herod constructed cities, fortresses, and palaces. Caesarea Maritima, a port city named in honor of Caesar, showcased Roman architecture, amphitheatres, and aqueducts, integrating Judea into the broader Hellenistic and Roman world. Fortresses like Masada and Herodium displayed both his architectural ambition and his obsession with security. These projects stimulated the economy and demonstrated Judea's significance within the empire. On the other hand, Herod's reign was also remembered for cruelty, paranoia, and political violence. He executed members of his own family, including his wife Mariamne and several sons, to eliminate potential rivals. His brutality extended to the broader population, as he crushed opposition and maintained power through fear. Later, Christian tradition associated him with the massacre of the innocents, the killing of infants in Bethlehem, though this account appears only in Matthew's Gospel and is not corroborated elsewhere. Still, the association reflected his reputation for ruthless suppression of any perceived threat. Herod's rule highlighted the ambivalence of Jewish life under Rome. On one level, Judea enjoyed relative peace. prosperity, and monumental splendor. On another, political autonomy was gone, leadership was compromised, and Roman influence permeated every aspect of life. The temple, though grand, was also a reminder that its renovator owed his throne to Rome, not to covenantal promise. This tension created fertile ground for discontent, messianic expectation, and resistance. After Herod's death in 4th Author BCE, his kingdom was divided among his sons, none of whom matched his political skill. Archelaus received Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, but was deposed after a decade due to misrule. Herod Antipas ruled Galilee and Perea, remembered for his role in the execution of John the Baptist. Philip governed territories in the northeast. With Archelaus's removal, Judea came under direct Roman administration, governed by prefects or procurators appointed by Rome. One of these, Pontius Pilate, would later preside over the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. The Roman administration combined tolerance with control. On one hand, Jews were allowed to maintain temple worship, observe Sabbath, and follow dietary laws. Rome generally avoided direct interference in religious matters, recognizing the importance of Jewish traditions. On the other hand, heavy taxation, military presence, and the appointment of high priests by Roman authorities fueled resentment. The high priesthood, once hereditary, became a political office subject to Roman manipulation, eroding its credibility. The combination of economic burdens and religious compromises deepened discontent. This environment gave rise to various Jewish responses. Some, like the Sadducees, aligned with priestly elites and cooperated with Rome to preserve their positions. The Pharisees emphasized strict observance of Torah and oral traditions, maintaining identity through law rather than political power. The Essenes withdrew from society, forming communities in the desert where they awaited divine intervention. The Zealots, by contrast, advocated violent resistance, preparing for revolt against Rome. These sectarian divisions reflected both the vitality and the fragmentation of Jewish life under Roman rule. Diaspora communities also flourished during this time. Jews in Alexandria, Babylon, and Asia Minor maintained their traditions while engaging with Hellenistic culture. The Septuagint allowed Greek-speaking Jews to preserve scripture, while synagogues became central institutions for worship, teaching, and community life. These diaspora communities reinforced the idea that Jewish identity could thrive beyond the land, though Jerusalem and the Temple remained the symbolic centre. The world into which Jesus was born was thus one of tension, expectation, and complexity. Politically, Rome held ultimate power, with client kings and governors administering Judea. Economically, heavy taxation fueled resentment, even as trade and construction brought prosperity. Religiously, the temple stood as both symbol of pride and flashpoint of conflict, while diverse sects offered competing visions of fidelity and hope. Socially, the people longed for deliverance, whether through political revolt, spiritual renewal, or divine intervention. Messianic expectations ran high in this environment. The memory of the Davidic covenant, the trauma of exile, the victories of the Maccabees, and the oppression of Rome combined to create a longing for a deliverer. Some envisioned a military leader who would overthrow Rome, others a priestly figure who would purify worship, and still others a prophet who would renew covenant faithfulness. The diversity of these expectations reflected both the richness of tradition and the urgency of the crisis. Rome, Herod, and the structures of Hellenistic culture provided the backdrop for the emergence of Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth was born in a world shaped by centuries of covenant history, exile, restoration, and foreign domination. The questions that defined Jewish life under Rome, how to remain faithful, how to resist assimilation, how to hope for deliverance, formed the context of his ministry. The temple, the law, the prophets, and the divisions within Judaism all framed the world into which he entered. Thus, the Roman period was not merely the political setting of the New Testament, but the culmination of Hebrew history as it had unfolded through promise, exile, return, and struggle. From Abraham's covenant to the oppression in Egypt, from David's kingdom to the exile in Babylon, from the Maccabees' revolt to Herod's reign, the story had prepared the ground for a new chapter. The Hebrews, now widely known as Jews, lived in a world dominated by empire, yet sustained by covenant identity. Their resilience under Rome testified to the survival strategies forged in exile and refined under Persia and Greece. Into this world charged with tension and hope, Jesus was born, inaugurating a movement that would carry Hebrew traditions into a new phase of history.